Biology is the representation, the extrinsic appearance of a dissociative process in the mind of nature. And that is why I don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda. And I will not know for as long as I am alive, because life is what dissociation looks like. So to go back to your previous question, what is it like to be nature from a first person perspective? Well, I don't think we can answer that for as long as we are alive. But when you're dead and that day is coming, you will know, because you will be it again. Death, the end of life, is the end of the dissociation, because dissociation is what, I mean, life is what dissociation looks like. So you will know, and I would even say you will remember, because you were that before you were born. You were in that, unified state of mind. And we are all going back to being that. There is no escaping that part.
Today's episode is with Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo is an idealist, arguing that universal phenomenal consciousness is all there ultimately is. He holds 2 PhDs, one in computer engineering and another in philosophy. He is also the executive director of the Essentia Foundation. If you enjoy this content, you can help support this podcast by joining the Patreon at the link below. And so with that, I'm super happy to introduce this interview with Bernardo Kastrup. All right, Bernardo. So I've been listening to a lot of your recent interviews over the past few days, and in those you do a really good job of exploring and explaining your metaphysics. So I do want to cover some of that here now, but also spend most of the time exploring some other stuff that you might not have been asked yet. So just to start things out here, could you give us a short version or maybe a speed run of what your metaphysics are and what they look like?
Well, obviously, nature's sole given, the only thing we know for sure to exist is mental processes, mental stuff, our thoughts, our perceptions, our feelings. And I think we can make sense of all empirical observations, including the obvious fact that there is a world out there beyond our individual minds. We can make sense of all that by acknowledging that only mental processes exist. Now, not your mental processes alone, not my mental processes alone, but mental processes at large that constitute nature out there at the most fundamental level. And what we call the physical or material world is an internal cognitive representation of whatever is going on out there, which are mental processes. So, to put it in a metaphorical way, the physical world is our dashboard of perception, the dials that show us the results of measurements we make on the world out there through our sense organs. And those measurements are presented to us in the form that we call physicality or materiality. But physicality is not primary, it is a cognitive representation. There is a world out there, but it's not physical. It is mental, made of transpersonal mental processes that are represented as physical processes once we make a measurement on the world out there with our sense organs. That's it in a nutshell.
What does it mean for something to be a transpersonal mental process?
Well, from your point of view, my thoughts are objective. You cannot control my thoughts. My thoughts would exist even if you were not here, even if you're not around. Um, so, what I'm saying is that there are objective, from our perspective, objective mental processes out there that are not yours and are not mine either. They are not the mentation of any living being. They are natural, spontaneous mental processes unfolding in nature at large. And we represent those mental processes out there as we call materiality or physicality, just in the way that your inner sadness presents itself physically as tears and contorted facial muscles. The transpersonal mental processes of nature at large, transpersonal in the sense that they are not personal, They're not your mental processes or my mental processes. They're not the mental processes of a living creature. They are the mental processes that underlie the inanimate universe as a whole. They too present themselves in physical form, just as your sadness presents itself as tears and contorted facial muscles. The thought processes of nature at large present themselves as the cosmos.
So there's the sense of there being something outside the boundaries of my sense organs, and there's that field, and that field is made of consciousness, and that interacts with my sense organs. And then, from my perspective, since I'm like a topologically segmented mind, I am like locally bound, don't have access to the contents of other minds. I get the sense of indirect realism where all I experience is consciousness, and all that's interacting with me is consciousness, but I don't know the consciousness outside of the surface of my own sense organs in and of itself.
Yes, that's correct. And that we should have no problem with that. We acknowledge that other people have mental processes, that other people have thoughts, have emotions, have feelings, have fantasies. But those thoughts, from our perspective, they are objective. They do not depend on us to exist. They are out there. We cannot change the thoughts of other people by merely wishing them to be different. So, although thoughts are inherently subjective from their own point of view, the thoughts of other people are objective from our point of view. So, mental processes are inherently subjective from their own first person perspective, but we can always speak of objective mental processes so long as we are dissociated from them, like you are dissociated from my thoughts and I from yours. So, the notion that there are mental processes in nature that are not ours is trivial. The moment you grant that your loved one also has a mental inner life, a conscious inner life, you're granting that there exist mental processes in nature that are not yours. There's nothing new about this. It's entirely trivial and self evident. All I am doing is to say that it applies not only to other living creatures, it applies to the universe at large, because matter, when it comes to a living being, matter is what our conscious inner life looks like from the outside. That's why patterns of brain activity correlate with our inner experience. Patterns of brain activity are what our inner experience look like when observed from the outside, from across a dissociative boundary. Uh, if matter is that when it comes to a living being, what I'm doing is saying, why should we invent an arbitrary discontinuity in nature? If the matter of my brain is what mental processes look like, then all matter in the universe, because the universe is made of the same types of atoms and force fields as my brain, that matter out there too is what mental processes look like, but not the mental processes of a living being, not the high level thoughts, self awareness, metacognition of a human that has evolved over 4 billion years on planet Earth in the context of a planetary ecosystem. They are probably simple, non metacognitive mental processes that underlie nature. Nature's behavior is very predictable. That's why we talk about the laws of nature as opposed to the preferences of nature. And if what we call the laws of nature are the regularities of what the mental processes underlying nature look like, then those mental processes are regular and predictable themselves, meaning that from its own first person perspective, the thoughts of nature seem to be simple, very regular, very predictable. You could say instinctive, and not metacognitive, not deliberate like you and I are. That would be an anthropomorphization that is not justified by evidence or reason, I think.
If consciousness is the intrinsic nature of the physical, so if everything that we've normally taken to be the material or physical world, if the intrinsic nature of that is consciousness, then um, infinite consciousness only knows its own dynamism through finite minds, or minds which are like topologically segmented from the rest. That, as you and I do have metacognition, we're able to talk about the contents of our own mind, whereas the infinite mind outside ourselves doesn't have that metacognition because it hasn't evolved that. Um, so what I'm curious about is what the qualitative relationship is between my actual experience of the world and the qualia that I have there, and then what it means for the world outside of myself and in and of itself to be a field of consciousness, a field of qualia.
So you want to have a some idea about what it feels like to be nature at large. That's what
Sure.
you're asking. It's it's near impossible, of course. I mean, we can't even know what it is like to be a fly or a mosquito. Arguably, you can't even know what it is like to be a cat, let alone what it is like to be the inanimate universe. I think there is only one thing we can say with in high confidence. There is a particular quale, a particular quality of experience that the modern analytic philosophers call core subjectivity. Core subjectivity is your sense of I-ness before you dress it up with a particular narrative of self. Like, I am this person born in that year who does this for a living, married to that other person. Before you bring in all this stuff, all this personal story, um, there is a core sense of pure subjectivity or core subjectivity, which is the sense of subjectivity of a newborn, or the sense of subjectivity you would have if you were in a perfect sensory deprivation chamber and you suddenly became completely amnesic. What would remain behind is this core subjectivity, this pure I-ness. And core subjectivity inherent in the field of consciousness. We have very, very good analytical reasons to think that. Postulating otherwise creates all kinds of discontinuities and problems. So it's safe to say that the universe at large, the inanimate universe as a whole, has core subjectivity. But beyond that, particular contents of experience, yeah, it's anybody's guess.
So I think I have two questions about that. One is, human beings' experiences are finite. I keep using this phrase, topologically segmented. I don't have access to the contents of other minds, and so there's a sense in which the field of consciousness has the non-local self has become localized in a particular human mind body through a particular perspective. So the question is like, is the is mind at large, or the field of consciousness, is it like mind dust, in that like very, very, very small particulates of consciousness are kind of like fuzzing as the ground of being? Or is it actually like topologically whole, like kind of like a vast void with this like fundamental subjectivity? Uh, and I'll save my second question for after this.
I think we have no reason to think of the consciousness that underlies the inanimate universe as something compound or segmented or dust-like. The error here, and I understand the motivation to think that is, well, the universe seems to be made of subatomic particles, and subatomic particles are, as the name implies, particulate. So if the image of the mentation of the universe is particulate, shouldn't the mentation itself be particulate? There are several errors of logic committed here. One is to attribute to the perceiver the structure of what is represented on the screen of perception. These are different things. The screen of perception has its own resolution, has its own structure, which are artifacts of representation. I mean, you're looking at a screen right now, and unless you're using a Mac computer with a retina display, if you look close enough, you will see that my representation on your screen is made of little rectangles or pixels. That doesn't mean that Bernardo's subjectivity is made of parts. It only means that Bernardo's representation on a screen has an artifact because of the resolution and the structure of the screen. We call it pixels, pixelation. Subatomic particles are the pixels of the physical universe. In other words, the pixels of the representation. That doesn't mean that the thing represented is itself compound or has a particulate structure. As a matter of fact, modern physics, well, we have known since at least the late 40s, arguably since the late 20s, 1920s, that there are no such things as particles with discrete spatial boundaries. That was the thinking in the late 19th and very early 20th century. But since the advent of quantum field theory in the 40s and everything that preceded it in the 20s and 30s, we know that what we call particles are just ripples on a field, just like ripples in water. If there is a ripple on a lake, you can point at it and say it is there. There is a ripple, and you can see it moving, and it has physical properties. It has a height, it has some breadth, it has speed and direction of movement, it has a certain mass. But you cannot grab the ripple and lift it off the lake because the ripple is not a thing. The ripple is a doing. The ripple is something the lake is doing. There's nothing to the ripple but the lake. That's what subatomic particles are and need to be for us to be able to reconcile quantum mechanics with special relativity and to make sense of a great many things like quantum fluctuations. Quantum fluctuations are subatomic particles that spontaneously pop into existence out of nothing and spontaneously disappear, leaving no trace behind. Well, if you imagine particles as little balls, as marbles, then quantum fluctuations amount to magic. But we know that that's not what particles are. Particles are ripples. There is nothing to a particle but the underlying quantum field. And quantum fluctuations are not magical because the quantum fields ripple spontaneously every now and then. Um, so even the physical universe, if we look closely with you know, the entire theoretical apparatus that we have at our disposal today, even the physical universe as a representation isn't really particulate. The only segmentation that we still have to deal with today is that there are 17 different quantum fields for different families of particles. But there are many efforts at grand unification theories which try to reduce that to a single field. Now, that proves to be extraordinarily difficult. Mathematically speaking, it's very complex. But we know that that's how nature must be, because without that, we can't reconcile even quantum field theory with gravitation, with general relativity. So we know that that's the way we have to go. So, yeah, there are many ways that there is no justification for us to say that because the universe seems to be made of little things, that consciousness is made of little things. It's not.
How does that relate to the fact that the experiences of sentient creatures are finite and topologically segmented? So perhaps mind at large is a unified whole, but if the fragmentation isn't going down to the smallest level, there's still fragmentation at the level of particular beings.
Of course, we have to look at what we know about mind. What we know about physics is very useful, very important, but physics is the science of the representations, of the screen of perception, things that we perceive. But we have psychology and psychiatry to try to get some insight into how minds can become segmented. And guess what? We have known for 200 years, but with particular depth since the turn of the 21st century, that there is a mental phenomenon called dissociation, which does precisely that. It fragments a mind into what psychiatrists call separate alters or alter personalities. In humans, this is usually a response to trauma, an attempt at ego defense as a response to trauma. If the person cannot bear the entire trauma, all the memories of what has happened and all the implications of it, the mind fragments, such as so that's to so as to compartmentalize that trauma and that memory so the mind is not exposed to all of it at once and therefore be overwhelmed by it. And dissociation does exactly what it needs to do for us to be able to account for the fact that I can't read your thoughts and you can't read mine, and I have no idea what's going on, not even in China, let alone in the galaxy of Andromeda. So if there is only one mind in nature, which is the most logical and parsimonious thing to postulate and avoid problems, then how come I don't know what's going on in the galaxy of Andromeda? Because I am part of the one mind of nature. Well, dissociation is responsible for it. We know that it does exactly this in people. We know it's a real phenomenon that has been studied under neuroimaging technology now. We know that people are not lying, people are not dissimulating. There is something dissociative processes in the brain look like. You can diagnose dissociative identity disorder based on fMRI images, functional brain scans. So if something like dissociation, analogous to dissociation, happens at a higher hierarchical level in nature, then it should also look like something. We should also be able to diagnose dissociation in mind at large, not only in the mind of an individual. And my contention is that yes, we are able to diagnose it. Dissociation in the mind of nature has an image. There is something it looks like, and it is what we call life. It is what we call biology. Biology is the representation, the extrinsic appearance of a dissociative process in the mind of nature. And that is why I don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda. And I will not know for as long as I am alive, because life is what dissociation looks like. So to go back to your previous question, what is it like to be nature from a first person perspective? Well, I don't think we can answer that for as long as we are alive. But when you're dead and that day is coming, you will know, because you will be it again. Death, the end of life, is the end of the dissociation, because dissociation is what, I mean, life is what dissociation looks like. So you will know, and I would even say you will remember, because you were that before you were born. You were in that unified state of mind. And we are all going back to being that. There is no escaping that part.
I think one very cool theory I heard from my friend Andres Gomez Emilson was that in Nirodha Samapati, the ninth jhana, like potentially an implication of this is that you return back to the infinite field, like as like all of the brain processes shut down, and like the thing that is creating the dissociation, or the topological pocket, like dissociates, and like you've stopped reifying space and stopped reifying time, and there's just nothing left, and you like go back to oblivion. It's like merging back, at least for a little bit, with the infinite field that is like contentless and formless and timeless and um without problem.
I'm not fluent or even versed in the world's religious traditions or spiritual traditions. So I reserve judgment about what it must feel like to return to the original state of consciousness. Um, yeah, I'll leave it at that. I don't know what it will feel like. But I would say with very high confidence that wherever it is, we will register it as a remembrance and not as a new fact. Because when you become less dissociated, you reintegrate things, and the way a reintegration feels like from a first person perspective is a recall. We call it recall. I recall how it was. I recall this. I remember that trauma. It will be recall. Now, notice that going from a highly dissociated state to a less dissociated state is a trivial occurrence in life. It happens every day you wake up. When you are asleep and dreaming, you are dissociated. Even within your own personal mind, you are dissociated because you think you are your dream avatar. And you think that the trees and the houses and the cars and the other people are not you in the dream. When you wake up, your dream avatar dies, and you realize that you were doing the whole thing. It was your mind doing the whole thing, but nobody goes around crying and mourning the death of their dream avatar. So, so that's a reason to be optimistic.
At the level of mind at large, or like the infinite field of consciousness, or like self with a capital S, it would seem like there's no structure. And therefore, like the thing about remembering seems deeply beautiful and true. It's like, oh yeah, like I'm not this like limited mind body self. Like I remember. Um like, oh, like we've, say, experienced that primordial state. It's only that like we've forgotten it. But that primordial state seems also to have absolutely no structure or like mechanism by which remembering would happen. Like remembering seems like something that happens upon like conditioned form. But like how does form remember formlessness? It seems impossible.
I think I know where you're coming from. You're coming from statements that you hear often in non-duality circles. I do not think that mind at large is contentless. I think it's valid to speculate about a original state of consciousness that was formless and had no content. But at least since the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, um, there seems to have been a lot of dynamism. Stuff happens in nature. And look, to recognize that the physical universe is a representation and not the thing in itself does not mean that there is nothing to be learned from the representations. An airplane's dashboard is a representation of the sky outside. And a pilot can navigate safely by instruments alone and land safely only by looking at that representation. But to do that, the pilot needs to take the representation seriously. If you ignore your dashboard, you're going to crash the plane. So yes, the dashboard is not the sky outside. It's a representation thereof. We shouldn't confuse the two. And we do when we say that the world is physical. We are basically saying the sky is the dashboard. That's untrue. But that doesn't mean that we should not take the dashboard seriously or that the dashboard doesn't convey valid, important information. So the dashboard that we call the physical universe is telling us that a lot of stuff has been happening for 13.8 billion years at least. And if the representations are dynamic, then the thing represented has to be dynamic. It has to have internal structure and internal dynamics. Otherwise, the representations would not have structure and would not be dynamic. So I think going back to mind at large does not mean the same as going back to the primordial state of consciousness that may have preceded the Big Bang. These are not the same things. I think, upon the end of our dissociation, the end of life, I think we will be faced with a lot of structure, a lot of dynamism, because we will become the universe again. And you look around you and look at the representations we call the universe. Stuff's happening everywhere. Stars are going supernova. Black holes are swallowing galaxies. There's a lot of stuff happening.
There's a lot of stuff happening. Uh, I think the hope with enlightenment is that that returning happens within a human lifetime. So not you don't need to die for the full dissociation to happen. You can let the universe take over the mind body system before you die. Um, I'm curious about more about this mind at large. I still feel confused about the experience of that, particularly because, as we've mentioned, the experience of persons is topologically segmented. I don't have access to your experience or right now the experience of mind at large. Maybe something that I just something maybe something about what I just said is wrong. Um, but in addition to that, of course, there's all this dynamism, right? And of course, like as you say in other interviews that you've done, science isn't something that tells us about what's metaphysically true, but it explains and makes predictions about the dynamism. And that all seems to be like conditioned phenomena to me. Like, fine, okay. Um, what also comes up for me is that which can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Um, Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj is someone I think you also are a fan of. And the self from that perspective is unchanging and eternal. And I mean, Nisargadatta so far gone that he's like, I'm like, what are you talking about? This like reality stuff? Like, I'm not even I'm not even here right now. Uh, without like rejecting the dynamism or what science tells us about it, but that like that true nature extends beyond the coming and going of conditioned reality. And so you say, you know, it seems like a lot's been going on since the Big Bang. And like, yes, a lot has been going on since the Big Bang, but that seems to be like a relative perspective. At the ultimate perspective, like Srina Sargadatta, I'd be like, nothing has happened at all.
How do I address this? Look, I am not an enlightened person. I'm not a spiritual teacher. I'm not enlightened. And what I try to get across is is an analytic philosophical position to do with ontology and not necessarily with the root nature of the self, um, which is what Eastern spirituality tries to address. So I'm not playing in the same field. I'm not capable of that kind of play. Again, I'm not an enlightened being. So if I can't give you any authoritative um, answer to this question, I can only share my suspicions, um, which again are based on analysis and not necessarily direct first person experience, even though I have had a few. Um, since Maxwell in the early 19th century, the guy who wrote down the equations of electromagnetism, um, and therefore came up with this notion of fields, brought the notion of fields into science, as opposed to things, as opposed to entity. Well, a field is an entity, but there is an opposition between fields and things. Fields are not things; they are spheres of potential. Um, Once that idea was inserted into science, it took off because we realized that we could make sense of a whole lot of seemingly insoluble problems with that. um, um, Quantum electrodynamics represented the next step of bringing fields into science and beyond what Maxwell did, because Maxwell's fields apply to photons, um, electrons, but we extended that for every family of particles, and we solved so many things, and including in cosmology, why there is any structure and complexity in the universe at all, because immediately after the Big Bang, there was a completely uniform, homogeneous distribution of energy. Nothing that could clump up into stars and planets and galaxies. So how come things clumped up into structure, into complexity? Well, we know that from the cosmic background radiation, which tells us that there were fluctuations in the original quantum fields, which account for everything that exists today. So the idea of fields explains everything, literally. Not only gravity and laboratory experiments with entangled particles, it explains the cosmos, the structure of the cosmos. Everything arose from fluctuations of fields. If you buy into this idea and into idealism at the same time, the notion that all nature is a mind, then the field is a mind. What we call a field is a theoretical representation of subjectivity. And then, what is it like to be that field? There is something it is like to be it because it's a mind. What is it like to be that field when it's not being excited, when it's not fluctuating, when it's entirely at rest? Maybe that's what the mystics are talking about. Maybe that's what the Vedas and the Upanishads are talking about as the great void of pure potentiality. It matches extremely well with the notion of fields. If fields are not excited, then they are pure potentiality. There are no things when fields are not excited. Things are excitations of the field. Particles are excitations of the field. If the field is not being excited and it is a mind, then it is a mind without contents, because contents are excitations of mind. What is that like? Maybe that's what people are talking about, and maybe that's what enlightenment is about, is to try to go through the noise of all the excitations of the field and try to discern that original core subjectivity without excitations that underlies everything. If that's what it is, I haven't been there. So I don't know it from direct acquaintance. I'm just trying to make an analogy that I think is reasonable.
You mentioned core subjectivity again, and that reminded me of a something I was interested in pursuing further. You were talking about psychology earlier, and that there was this like rudimentary subjectivity that had been, I'm not sure, uh, arrived at as apparently true. Something that was like a basic form of subjectivity. Like if we were in a sensory deprivation tank where your modeling of like the body and the world begins to downregulate, you get the core sense of subjectivity. So the question then becomes, um, in your perspective, is there such a thing as formless or contentless consciousness, right? One might suspect that even in like highly sensorially deprivated states where there's a extreme down regulating of everything, that in order for there to be consciousness at all, there might have to be some kind of modeling of something, even like very subtle space or very subtle time or something very subtle. Otherwise, because of interdependence, consciousness couldn't arise or there couldn't be any awareness. What's your perspective on that?
I think that's nonsense. I think people, I know why people come at this, and that is to account for human consciousness, the human sense of self. Heidegger talked about being in the world and our sense of being directly related to our presence in the world. In other words, in our presence within something that isn't us. So to have human type consciousness, you need some kind of opposition of that sort. Um, but when an analytic philosopher talks about phenomenal consciousness, he's not talking about a inner model of the self, which is arrived at in opposition to something that isn't the self. We are not talking about, and I'll use a technical word, phenomenal consciousness does not depend on aboutness. You can have a purely endogenous quale, a quality of experience that is entirely endogenous and does not entail a sense of self as a discrete entity as opposed to the world. So I don't think any of that is required for there to be phenomenal consciousness. We don't need aboutness for phenomenal consciousness.
Sure. So what I mean is not that we require a world model in order to be conscious, or that we require a self model to be conscious. I think what I'm trying to point towards is that, and for example, in levels of meditative absorption, the process is like defabricating experience. So, like at a naive level, people will say, if you don't have a self and a world model, then like there's no consciousness. Like obviously that's not true because there's still more to defabricate. There are still parts of like the world simulation that we call consciousness, like space and time, and like there are these six sense doors like feeling, taste, touch, and mentation. Um, but you can continue to defabricate all of these. And like when I mentioned sorry to enter territory here that's like not part of uh, what you tend to look into, but
It's okay.
the Nirodha Samapati, this like ninth jhana state of like what we mentioned is potentially returning to like static field without like potentiation. That there's no consciousness there is what other people on my podcast have said. What my understanding of it is, I don't have this experience, but that because there's no longer a representation of anything, there's consciousness like it's lights out. There's nothing to remember, nothing to grasp onto. Um, and so I think I'm trying to speak to like a subtler level or like a deeper level of defabrication that like even the most rudimentary form of consciousness. I'm curious if your perspective is that that in itself requires a knowing of something. Like, is it possible for there to be pure knowing of just consciousness itself?
There is no need for there to be aboutness, for there to be a knowing of something, for there to be consciousness. Um, Let me comment a little bit on what you just brought up. Um, Back to the field model. I think fields are a fantastic model for mind, and there is a reason why they seem to work in science. Um, if experiences are excitations of the field of consciousness, then the field of consciousness without being excited does not entail an experience. The point that I'm trying to make is that the field is not a thing, not even an experience. The field is the potential for an experience. So if phenomenal consciousness is a field, it is the potential for experiences. And that potential is realized when the field is excited. And we know it gets excited spontaneously. It did just after the Big Bang and continues to do in the laboratory today. We know there are things called virtual particles, which are spontaneous excitations of the quantum fields. And we know that you can even measure them. This thing was measured for the first time in a laboratory here in the Netherlands in the 40s. I used to work in that laboratory. Well, in the 90s, not in the 40s, but I used to work there. Um, so, is it consistent with my view that you could get into a state of consciousness where there is no experience? Sure, if consciousness is the field, then consciousness is the potential. If the field is not excited, then there is no experience, but there is consciousness. And again, experience is, there's nothing to experience but consciousness. In the same way that there's nothing to the ripple but the lake. So even when there is excitation and there is experience, the only thing going on is still only consciousness, which is the only thing that is there when it's not being excited. You know, if when you pluck a guitar string, you hear a note, but there is nothing to that note other than the guitar string in movement. When the guitar string is not plucked, there is no note, but it's still the guitar string. It's still the same thing. And the only thing that is there, whether you pluck it or not, the note is a doing of the guitar string. So experiences are a doing of consciousness. What is consciousness itself? What is that guitar string? Well, that's fundamentally impossible for us to say because we are it. And every act of knowledge, every act of investigation is already an excitation of that field, is already a plucking of the guitar string. So the fundamental nature of the thing that is excited is completely beyond its own possibility to know, which is the cosmic itch, of course. It is an itch that you can't scratch, fundamentally. Um, Now, what people refer to as this great void state, I have two speculations about it. One is if it is a completely non-excited state of consciousness, which is coherent to infer that it could happen, then there's nothing to talk about, there's nothing to remember. And then how do they know that they've been there? You see? Because there's nothing. What is there to talk about? How do they know? All they know is they don't remember. Does that mean that they were there or just that they don't remember? There are other sages and students of spirituality who I have seen or read that report that you can experience the void and you can remember that. And I had a psychedelic trip once, a very high dose psychedelic trip, in which during the trip I thought this is what the Buddhists mean by the void. It's that there's nothing here except the knowing of being there, which is an experience. And it's an experience you can talk about. Now, if that's what the void is, then I would say the void is a carrier wave. I keep using this communications metaphors because I also have a degree in electronics engineering. A carrier wave is a fundamental tone. When you are driving your car and you select a radio station, you're tuning to a particular frequency, to a particular carrier wave, which is excited. It is a vibration of the electromagnetic field with a certain frequency. And the radio program is modulated on top of it. It's a further excitation of that carrier wave. Now, if you think our ordinary experiences are like the radio program, a modulation of a carrier wave, when the program stops and nobody's saying anything, then all you have is the carrier wave. It's a fundamental tone. In Indian philosophy, they call it the drone. Even in Indian classical music, they call it the drone. There is always this background note, a constant background note, which is the drone, and the music is a modulation that comes on top of the drone. So it is coherent to imagine that it is impossible for a field of subjectivity to be completely unexcited, completely at rest. there is always a carrier wave. There is always a fundamental tone. And if people have been to the void and they remember it and they can talk about it, then what they experienced was the tone. Because there has to be something happening for them to remember something. And today I tend to think that the latter option is the more coherent one. I think mind is never completely at rest. There is always a fundamental tone, that core subjectivity. There is always a drone, which is what people refer to as the void, and that's why they remember it.
And which is also why you were saying before that before we were born and after we die, we will know that again. And if we
Yes,
know it in this lifetime, then it is a sense of remembering because there's a carrier tone which acts as the kind of information baseline for remembrance.
that's too, but I would go further. I think after you die, you're just no longer dissociated from mind at large. But mind at large is not experiencing only the fundamental tone. There's a lot of stuff going on in the universe that must correlate with a lot of inner activity, a lot of inner structure. So I think that remembering the original state is beyond just remembering the drone. It's remembering everything that's going on in mind at large, whatever that is, however inconceivable it is to a human mind that has forgotten that state.
So I just want to share this quote here that I got from another podcast that you did that seems to match this part of the conversation here. So it's from Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj. He says, "When you see the world, you see God. There is no seeing God apart from the world. Beyond the world, to see God is to be God." And then he goes on, "The light by which you see the world, which is God, is the tiny little spark I am, apparently so small, yet the first and the last in every act of knowing and loving."
Yes, the I am is core subjectivity. That's how analytic philosophers call it today. And Nisargadatta had his eyes on the ball. If the physical universe is a representation of the mental activity of the divine mind, if he wants to use that word, then the physical universe, the inanimate universe, is the body of God, because that's what bodies are, representations of inner mental activity. And therefore, if you want to see God, to see is an appeal to perception. It's an appeal to acquaintance through the intermediation of a dashboard, through the intermediation of representation. So, in that sense, to see God is to see the universe, because the physical, inanimate universe is the body of God, is the representation of God. It's the only way you can perceive God. So, if you want to see God, look up to the stars at night, and you are seeing the mental processes of the divinity's mind. But if you want to go further, if you want to remove the intermediation, if you don't want the representations, you want to become acquainted with the thing in itself, as it is in itself, then you need to be God. Because to experience, well, to know God from a first person perspective is to be a God. So Nisargadatta, despite his only 2 years of basic school education, he had his eyes right on the ball. It's amazing. It makes philosophers with two PhDs like me very humbled, um, because we've been left in the dust by someone who had 2 years of school education.
So just want to hit on a few more things here in terms of ontology, and then I'd like to move on to morality and freedom from suffering, and the implications of this sort of thing. So I'm gonna just quickly hit on some of my favorite things that I've heard you say so far, and if you'd like to comment on them, then um, that would be great. The first is that the game of all games is knowledge by acquaintance, and acquaintance is by bringing knowledge into the body.
What do I mean by knowledge by acquaintance? What I mean by it is knowledge without the intermediation of a conceptual model, a mental abstraction, um, thinking up there, up here. Um, there are languages that make this distinction very well by using two different verbs for what in English is to know. We have it in the Germanic languages, we have it in the Latin languages. Um, in English, you would use a preposition to make the difference. For instance, I know of Barack Obama, but I don't know Barack Obama in the sense that I have never met him. Now, in Germanic and Latin languages, there are two different verbs for this. In the US, I think you're in the US, right? So you
Yeah.
probably would be more acquainted with the Spanish version, which is conocer and saber. Uh, and conocer is to know by direct acquaintance. I know the person. And saber is to know of, and I have a conceptual model about the person. Or, to know chess theoretically is different than to know chess by acquaintance, by playing the game of chess. Um, so what I meant is that the royal path to knowledge is always knowledge by acquaintance and not through the intermediation of theory. Theory points us in the right, in useful directions. But if you want to know nature as deeply as you can, you do not, you should not stop at theory, because that's indirect knowledge through the intermediation of abstract conceptual narratives. You are a part of nature. Nature expresses itself in you through being you. And by virtue of being a part of nature, a manifestation of nature, you can come to know nature by direct acquaintance. But that entails introspection. And the Western mind is extremely poor at introspection. Most analytic philosophers of mind just are completely incapable of properly introspecting. They don't even understand what is actually meant. Most neuroscientists of consciousness have no idea what consciousness is from a first person perspective.
They also think it's an epistemic like dead end, right? When you get materialism on board, there becomes this like epistemology that like there's nothing about introspection that could tell you about the physical world, right? And so all the best that we have is like conceptualization.
Yes, which of course is fantastically stupid,
Oh man.
because it's the mind that knows. If the mind doesn't know anything about that which knows, then what knowledge do you have?
What's coming up for me is that right, there's this distinction between the map and the territory, right? So even for materialists, this is uh, there's our conceptualization, which is our attempts to carve reality at the joints to create concepts which like accurately describe parts of reality. But then there's the territory in itself, which can't be known directly and is known indirectly through our sense organs. Um, but like you said, we're also the territory, and the territory can, it seems like the vehicle by which the territory knows itself is like surrender and uncertainty.
That would be the true knowledge of the self. But we don't even need to go that far to improve our science and our analytic philosophy. Look, um, poo-pooing introspection is something that has played a role in the early days of science, because it brought sort of an objective approach to experimentation. It did away with superstition. Um, and that was very useful. And when you're studying the inanimate universe out there as opposed to yourself, it is very handy. So handy, in fact, that it has become woven into the very fabric of the scientific approach, the scientific ethos. Um, the problem is that it works everywhere except when you are trying to study consciousness and mind and self. That's where it becomes a gigantic liability, because then you don't even begin to know what it is that you're studying. And in the neuroscience of consciousness, this has become a gigantic liability. In analytic philosophy of mind, it has become a gigantic liability. You have people who are so incapable of introspecting that they are basically intellectually handicapped. The eliminativists like Danny Dennett and Keith Frankish, it's a baffling intellectual handicap. Um, There was once I was having a debate with Christoph Koch, arguably the world's most preeminent neuroscientist, and Rupert Spira was in that debate as well. It was a trialogue organized by the Institute of Art and Ideas. I don't even know whether it's public already or not, but it is it is interesting if you follow that debate, especially in the engagements between Christoph and Rupert. How Rupert appeals to very basic introspection to try to ground what he's saying just flew entirely over the head of Christoph Koch. He just couldn't relate to any of it. He's completely unacquainted with mind through introspection, unacquainted with what it is like to be Christoph Koch having a conscious mind. And I noticed Rupert, well, if you can ever see Rupert frustrated, it's very difficult to see that. But if you can
Well,
ever
yeah.
pick up on any sort of gives that he's slightly frustrated, it was there. It's like, how come this man does not acknowledge the most basic given facts of being a mind? Why do you need to go about everything through indirection, through conceptual abstraction? And so you see how serious that handicap is in science and philosophy when it comes to the study of mind.
So the next one that I loved was you were discussing that or you were discussing how physicalism robs us of meaning as the entities outside of us are their own ends.
Yes, um, under physicalism, the physical world is not a representation. It's not pointing at anything behind itself as representations do. I mean, when you read a book, the words are representations. Their meaning is beyond themselves. Otherwise, you would be dealing with squiggles of ink on paper. That's not what a book is. A book is an entire journey in mind because those squiggles of ink on paper point at something beyond or behind themselves. They are not their own end. They are not their own meaning. They connote, they denote. Under physicalism, the physical universe is its own meaning. It doesn't connote, it doesn't denote. It's not a dashboard representation of a deeper layer of reality. It is all there is. It is the thing in itself. And therefore, it literally robs the universe of its meaning. And I mean this in a semantic sense, not in a profound spiritual sense. I mean it in a very literal, direct sense. The universe, like the dials on the dashboard of an airplane, means something. If you read on the dial that your airspeed is becoming critically low, that means something, all right? You need to, rev up your engines because otherwise you will stall and your airplane will crash. The dials have meanings, and my understanding of reality is that the physical world are the dials, our internal cognitive representations. So they have meanings, and a meaningful life consists in going through the world, always asking yourself, what does this actually mean? What is all this stuff? Mountains, electric storms, black holes, supernovae, volcanoes. What is this a representation of? Because that's the meaning of life. That's the meaning of being immersed in the representations. Is an attempt to use our metacognition, evolved at great cost over 4 billion years on this planet, to investigate the representations and try to arrive at some form of metacognitive understanding by inferring their meanings. But materialism tells you there's nothing to understand there. All we need to do is to predict how the representations behave, which is what science does, predicts the behavior of nature. So we can build toys, like useful toys, like cell phones and computers and drugs, very useful toys, great toys, which allow us to live longer and more comfortably, but say nothing about what we live for. I mean, what do we live for? What life is about? Distracting yourself until you die? If if that's it, then if this is the reality, then we have to bite the bullet. But do we have good reason to think that this is the reality of the situation? I would say none at all. We have no good reason whatsoever, starting from, I would say, the established understanding that our cognitive states cannot be a mirror image of the world. Otherwise, there would be no upper bound to our internal entropy, and we wouldn't survive looking at the world. Our cognitive representations are encoded, and therefore they mean something. And this understanding restores meaning, literally, to life. And now you can start legitimately asking yourself, what do I live for? As opposed to, it's all for nothing. I just want to have fun and distract myself as much as I can, engage in as much addictive behavior as I possibly can afford, because one day it's all coming to an end and then I will be nothing and all my insights will be for nothing. Well, if this were the truth, if we had good reasons to believe this, it's horrible, but let's bite the bullet. But we don't have good reasons to believe it. And we have every reason to believe otherwise.
One thing that comes from Christianity is this idea that the truth will set you free. Um, in and this also appears to be a facet of the realization of self or true nature. Um, Idealism also, in many senses, sets you free from the existential limits and confines and problems of a materialist point of view. So do you think that there's a necessary relationship between truth and freedom from suffering?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, no doubt about that at all. Look, I don't think idealism as a conceptual model will set you free, because conceptual models reside in thought, and thought is not transformative. Even if you know something conceptually with a great deal of certainty, it will not change the way you feel from within, because it's just conceptual. But a conceptual model can open the doors by giving you intellectual permission to expose yourself to embodying a different way of being in the world, embodying a different ethos, which can be transformative. So I see conceptual theories like analytic idealism as a sort of a means to an end and not the end in itself. It's meant to open doors. It's meant to give us intellectual permission to explore by direct acquaintance what might actually be going on, which we all can do because we are parts of nature. We are not separate from nature. We are nature doing something that we call us. Um, has that happened to me? Well, to some degree, it did. I'm not a purely conceptual philosopher. Um, there's a sense in which you could say I'm a very old-fashioned type of philosopher, a philosopher that really embodies what he or she honestly believes to be true. Um, we haven't seen philosophy done that way since Nietzsche, arguably over 100 years. Um, Maybe Wittgenstein embodied to some extent, and the existentialists to some extent. But philosophy has become a conceptual game. For me, that's not philosophy. For me, the eagerness to find answers is not because I will publish a paper or get yet another doctorate. The eagerness to find answers is to inform my life. So I do embody my philosophy, and it did set me free. But if I say what it means to be set free, it will sound completely contradictory. Let me try. To be set free is to understand that your life has never been, is not, and will never be about you. Is to understand that even your mind does not exist as a thing in itself. It's a doing of the mind of nature. It's a dissociative complex in the mind of nature that doesn't have an autonomous existence, for the same reason that the alters of a patient with dissociative identity disorder do not have an autonomous existence. They are doings of the mind of the patient. We are doings of the mind of nature. None of this is about us. It has never been and will never be. My life is not about me. Um, as a doing of nature, my life is about nature. It's about what nature is trying to achieve through doing me, partly. So you could say that the freedom you arrive at is the freedom of the slave, is the understanding that you are a means to an end. you are serving a purpose here that you don't understand. You're probably intrinsically incapable of understanding because we are monkeys that have been running around a rock with an intellect for only 30,000 years. That's a blink of an eye ago. You know, the temerity of thinking that we can really understand what this is all about. Um, but you don't need to understand either. For the same reason that the hammer doesn't need to understand that the purpose is to nail a house together, even if the hammer doesn't understand this, it serves its purpose. The hammer doesn't need to understand the purpose of what it's doing. Neither do we. We do not need to understand whatever intrinsic, instinctive, spontaneous drive is behind the dynamisms of nature. We can't understand it, and nor do we need to. And it's okay to not understand it. And this is enormously liberating. The Western well being wisdom puts on the shoulders of egos a responsibility that egos can never hope to rise up to, the responsibility of being happy. Egos cannot bear that responsibility. We are not atlases. You cannot put the weight of the world on our shoulders. Egos crack. But our entire industry of well being, the entire wisdom of well being in the West is you have to take the reins of your life. You have to make a plan. that, sorry for the laugh, but this is so ridiculous that it's difficult to even say this without laughing. You have to make a plan for your happiness, for the purpose of your life, and you have to fight hard because everything is possible. You can achieve anything, and you can make yourself happy, and people believe it. And guess what? When they fail, as inevitably they will do, and even the seeming success is short lived. That's why you have so many rich and famous people killing themselves all the time or drugging themselves into oblivion. Um, when that inevitable confrontation with the impossibility of the situation comes, you're crushed. You become crushed. And I can see that you can resonate with this because it is impossible for a human being to carry the responsibility of the happiness of mind. It is preposterous. But by believing we can, we put ourselves in an alley that has no exit. And we just crush ourselves to death because we will always be disappointed. You will always get to that point where I failed. I did not rise up to the challenge. And social media is full of people who show their happiness. Bullshit. Bullshit. For social media is full of people pretending to themselves that they are there because that postpones having to face the bill at the end when your meal is over. Um, and we crush ourselves. So the liberty, the freedom, the liberation, at least for me, is this understanding that it's not about me. I do not have the responsibility to make myself happy. It's okay if I'm crushed, if I'm anxious, if I'm depressed. It's okay that I don't understand what this is all about. I don't need to understand. All I need to do, and now I'm speaking about myself, this is not wisdom that I'm selling as the truth. Um, you know, 10 years from now, I may be thinking differently about this, but today, for me, the only decision I have to make is whether I resist what nature is trying to do through me or whether I go along with it and I pay attention instead. And that's the freedom. That's the liberation. If you ask me, where do I want to be in 5 years? I will laugh because it's a preposterous question. Why? I mean, how can I know what nature will be trying to do through me in 5 years? I mean, it's preposterous. It's like an ant trying to solve the grand unification theory problem. You would laugh at the ant. And that's what we do. We try to be that ant. Um, so I don't know what nature will be trying to do through me in 5 years. I know one thing. Whatever it is, I won't resist it. Um, whatever comes out of my mouth is not mine. I have precisely one merit, exactly one choice and one merit. My choice is I don't resist, and my merit is I pay attention. And that's it. That's all there is to Bernardo Kastrup. It's very close to nothing. And that is so incredibly liberating. You stop adding meta suffering on top of suffering, because you cannot go through life without suffering. You will suffer. We all will, most of the time. But when you blame yourself for your suffering, that's meta suffering. That's adding injury to adding uh, insult to injury, uh, and multiplies the suffering by a large factor. That meta suffering I don't have anymore. I am neurotic. I have certain anxieties that come out of nothing for no reason, and I torture myself with them. I still do. What I don't do anymore is to torture myself because I shouldn't be torturing myself, if you know what I mean. I don't suffer from blaming myself. You bloody idiot, you're torturing yourself for no reason, and regretting and insulting me and feeling bad about me because I'm torturing myself for no reason. No, I just torture myself now. I just take account of it. Okay, I'm torturing myself now. Yeah, that's where things are going now. Um, and whatever I do in my day, it's not long-term planning. It's what the movements of the impersonal within me lead me to do, and I pay attention. So I discern now where the impersonal is trying to go through me. Usually it has nothing to do with my personal happiness or my personal security or my personal well-being. It's amazing how, what Socrates called the daimon, the impersonal within you. It's amazing how much it does not give a damn about whether you have a roof over your head tomorrow or a plate with warm food tomorrow. It doesn't care because it's not thinking at that local level. It's thinking at a universal level. And its thinking flow through you, and you think it's your thinking. And then you judge, and then you say, well, I'm not going to do that. It's not good for me. And then we divorce ourselves from nature. You see, that's our dilemma.
I'm noticing the marks of truth in myself because as you speak, I become increasingly empty, and then there's all this like joy and freedom that comes up. Uh, at some point, I was also noticing my ego was like grasping the inherent joy of the innate freedom and trying to like make it its own. I was noticing that. What's also coming up for me is again Christianity. I don't really have a Christian background, but not my will be done, but thy will be done. The daimon is like the non-local sense of truth or doing. It's not the egoic will. It's like it's lower, kind of like in the body, maybe around the gut. Um,
Mine is
sense
here,
of truth.
between the
Yours is
throat and
there.
the upper chest. Yeah.
That's what you're talking about. That hot iron ball
Yeah.
in your
It's
other
right here.
interviews. I see. Your diamon's a lot higher than mine. My diamond is like uh, a lot lower. Um, so the sense of surrendering to that, the sense of not being here, kind of like in the world but not of it, um, is my experience, and the acting in accordance with that is freedom.
There is freedom in the recognition that what you consider to be yourself doesn't really exist. It's a narrative. It's a society-wide addiction or a habit that has become addictive because you're trying to grasp to straws and there's nothing there, but we can't stop trying. Um, Normally I don't go down this more introspective avenues, but since we are talking about the implications of embodying idealism as a ontology, um, yes, this comes with the territory. If your intellectual understanding opens certain doors, it's very difficult to stop the process of sinking into what is initially just a conceptual understanding. You sink into it, or it sinks into you. I'm talking about the same thing here. And it begins to inform your emotions as well, how you feel. Um, in spirituality, there is all this talk about how to surrender. For as long as you're thinking about how am I going to surrender, surrender is impossible. Surrender happens to you. It's not something you you get to happen. Surrendering is a implication, a natural consequence of something else. And if you're trying to get to that consequence, then you will not allow that something else to happen. And therefore, you never get there, if you know what I mean. Um, and I don't even know how to share this because it's so personal. To me, it just happened. One day I woke up and I realized, shit, this has been happening for 6 months now, and I didn't even realize it. And then 2 years later, wow, this happened. It has actually happened. I've been like this for now 2 years. I didn't even see it coming. Um, and the surrender is not, when you have the agenda, I want to surrender because I want to stop suffering. It's not gonna work, buddy. That's exactly what you do in order to keep suffering. Um, when the blame game stops because there is no personal self, ego is just a complex of a mind, and it's all about nature. It's not about you. When the blame game stops, and it's okay for you to suffer, and at least for me, there was a time when I could sincerely look at myself in the mirror with absolute openness and sincerity. There was nobody else around. It was a conversation between me and myself. Nobody else would ever know about it, except that I'm talking about it now. I could sincerely look at myself in the mirror and say, I think you will suffer from anxiety for the rest of your life. And that was after 10 years of trying to get rid of it. 10 years, therapy, all kinds of things, trying to reduce anxiety. One day I looked in the mirror and I was spent. When you lose the fight and there's nothing more in you, it's like, okay, I've tried everything. There's nothing in me now. I'm spent. And you look in the mirror and you say with absolute sincerity, yeah, buddy, for the rest of your life, that's all you're going to know. You are going to be suffering from anxiety and torturing yourself until the moment of your death. And there is no solution. Nothing can work. There's nothing that can be done about it. When you say that sincerely to yourself, something changes within you. I don't know what it is. Something flips. And you don't notice it immediately. It's not like after this happens, oh, now I'm free from suffering. No. You stay with that energy of loss, of defeat for a while. And slowly something is changing deep within you. Then you don't notice at first. In hindsight, you do notice, but you only notice in hindsight. Something is changing, something is moving. And lo and behold, it is the very acknowledgement that I will suffer forever and there is no solution. That's what somehow, I cannot tell you how, somehow reduces the suffering. It's like it switches off the fuel pump. Something, some fuel doesn't get there anymore to the fire of self torture and suffering. Suffering is always self imposed. Pain is not. Suffering is always self imposed. Then the fuel gets reduced. And one day you realize it's okay if I suffer because it isn't about me. It has never been. Will never be. It's about nature working through me. And you are a slave of nature. There is a sense in which it's true to say, I am a slave of nature, and therein lies my freedom. I don't know whether people can wrap their heads around what I just said because it's so inaccurate what I said, but maybe you get a feeling for where I'm trying to go.
10 years of resistance uh, leads to something like a bottoming out. The
Yeah, there
suffering
was
comes from
more.
the resistance of more than 10 years of resistance to anxiety, and then on the other side is freedom. And the ending of that couldn't have come about by an act of will or choice. It's life squeezes the resistance out of you, and
Yeah, even the word surrender, I think it's the wrong word because it implies an act of volition. I choose to surrender. I think defeat is the proper word. You are smashed. You are defeated. And something very fundamental changes when you look in the mirror and you acknowledge with absolute sincerity, I have been defeated. Look, for me, I don't come from a religious or spiritual background, so my journey has been very strange. I lost my father when I was 12, and it was the moment in my father was much closer to me than my mother. Um, and I got into a sort of a state of mind as a defense to that, of conquering control, having control over life in all its facets. I needed to have control because something happened to me that destroyed my world as a kid that I had no control over, and therefore, as an adult, I will have control. And lo and behold, I had a list of things that I had to achieve to be in control, and I ticked every box by the time I was 2034, even 33. Um, yeah, 33. It was beginning of 2008. Every box was ticked. I had a beautiful own house. I was married to the girl I fell in love with when I was in my early 20s. I had a great job. I had money in the bank. I knew influential people. I had a position of power in the company I worked for, which was a Europe top 50. Now it's probably world top 50, ASML. Um, and then one day I woke up and I thought, I've arrived. I've arrived. I control it. I have money, I have power, I have influence, I have a career, I have a network, I have insurances for everything conceivable. Uh, I arrived. And then it's amazing how life exposes your bullshit quickly, very quickly. I found a nodule in the breast of my wife. And it took 2 weeks for doctors to rule out cancer. But during those 2 weeks, it was a very, very real possibility because all the indications were that, yeah, looks like it. Um, and those 2 weeks were seminal for me because they crushed my illusion of control. Because you realize that not only you are not in control, you have never been. Your body could have done something totally out of your control and ended your life. Could have gotten a mass, cancer, you know, a number of things. Or a comet could have struck the Earth. And then you start listing all the things that you actually cannot control. War can break out. Lo and behold, it has broken out now in this continent. Um, and to face that realization of the impossibility of being in control when you have just spent your entire life trying to be in control and thinking that you've succeeded, I cannot tell you the depth of anxiety this throws you in because your entire mind has adapted to the notion that I reduce anxiety by conquering control. My entire anxiety management in life, my entire adaptive self was about getting control. And I was pretty darn good about it. I probably was the youngest senior manager, director of my company at 33, um, which was like, I couldn't have even dreamed of that. I dreamed of working at CERN. It was my first job. I was 22. Um, and then you realize it has always been an illusion. You have no control. And the pungency of that realization just plunges you into an endless sea of anxiety about everything that can go wrong. And that was my anxiety over 10 years, 2008 to 2020, 12 years. And getting out of that is what I just described. It has never been about me. So it doesn't matter that I'm not in control. It doesn't matter if tomorrow I have cancer. I will not like it. I will have pain. I will suffer, but I'm not going to meta suffer. I'm not going to torture myself on top of whatever happens to me will already make me undergo. That was the idea.
One guest that I'm gonna have on the show soon, he has this framing that anxiety or these kinds of sufferings and pains that we have in life, not the meta suffering, but these anxieties that come up, that they're accurate perceptions of reality, and the extent to which we resist them, resist coming into congruence or harmony with these truths, is the extent to which we suffer. So there's a lot of anxiety. For example, it sounds like that it was pointing towards this fundamental truth that like there's nothing in your control. This is all outside of your control. And
And
resistance,
you
the
aren't even
acceptance.
there. You don't even really exist.
Yeah,
But okay.
sure, exactly. Um, so I mean, it just we can also add that on as a facet here, right? Because um, you're also describing some of the like movement towards non-local agency through Bernardo from the perspective of the local self. So you're saying like I am a slave to like what nature wants, but that's still, it seems to me, somewhat of imposing a duality on the situation, where it would seem to me that like a further freedom might be the cessation of that distinction.
I think, strictly speaking, you are correct. But there is another thing that happened to me over these years, which is I've come to embrace my Western background. I fought against it for a long time. I thought Western philosophy is inferior to Eastern philosophy. Western religion and spirituality is inferior to Eastern religion and spirituality. And I was on that trip of denying or at least poo-pooing my own inheritance, my own background for a long time. And things changed, and I now see the validity of the Western approach. I think it is okay for us to play the role of Bernardo Kastrup or Lucas. It, it's useful. We don't need to sublimate everything in order to achieve a kind of state of anesthesia. It is okay, as Jung put it, it's okay to engage with the images as opposed to trying to sublimate the images and going back to the nothingness. Look, we are happening. Nature is doing us. Who are we to understand whether this is sensible or senseless? We can't judge. All we can do is to go along with it in the hope that it is ultimately sensible, but beyond our ability to cognize or understand. So you embrace the game. And there is something to be said about embracing the game and not trying to sublimate it and not trying to rise to the level of nothingness and detaching from the world like the Indian sage after he's a householder, he goes up to the mountains into a cave and disappears for the rest of his life. I don't think that's the Western approach. And I think there is something to be said about the Western approach. And in that sense, I think one of our great losses was the loss of Christianity, because Christianity basically is saying the same thing if one has the eyes to see through the mythology, the metaphors. Um, and so does Islam. The word Islam means surrender. It starts from there. Uh, Christianity is not trying to say that you are the void and therefore sublimate everything. Christianity is saying there is a God, there is a relationship of kinship between the divinity and you, because Jesus was a man, a human, and he was the Son of God, and therefore of the same kind as God, because sons are always of the same kind as fathers. Moreover, when the Holy Spirit descended into every righteous man, woman, and child after the ascension of Christ, um, we became the Holy Spirit. It's written right there. It descended into every righteous human being. What is all that telling us? What that's telling us is that it's okay to pretend to be a person, an individual mind, separate from everything else, so long as your life is in service to what is really going on, so long as your life is in service to God, to the Godhead. I think this resonates a lot more with the Western mind because it doesn't call for that sublimation, which for the Western mind is so difficult to achieve, and becomes a sort of an exercise in anesthesia, which for the Eastern mind it is not. For them, it is not anesthesia. For them, it is true insight. But I think most of us, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think most of us adopt it without the full depth of understanding because we are looking to be anesthetized. We are looking for a break. We are looking for a little relief. That's what we are looking for. We can't bear the suffering anymore. We need relief. And so we transform what is in fact a rather deeper philosophy into an attempt at sublimation, while we do have our own tradition, which offers us different metaphors, different tools, a different ethos, a different way of being in the world that brings us to the same place. And that's why I don't talk about uh, destroying my ego. I talk about my ego being in service, the understanding that my ego is a slave. You see how I'm talking Western language, which is actually saying the same thing. The Eastern guy would say your ego doesn't exist. No, sublimate your ego, transcend your ego. It's not there. For us, it's very difficult. It's much easier for us to say, okay, we give a place to the ego. It's a role we play, but it's in service of something that isn't the ego. Islam is top of the world. It's world class on this. You bow to that something beyond the ego 5 times a day, and not only on Sunday mornings. All right, that's, and it's world class, and it's not. There's a reason they are the religion today with the most vitality, and I think this is an objective assessment. Doesn't mean that they are superior to Christianity in message, but today, I think they have the most vitality. But in Christianity, we have the same thing. If we will only re reestablish our relationship with it without the naivete and the silliness and the platitudes of taking things literally, that doesn't work. It will not work. But bringing in a new layer of nuance, new eyes to see through the metaphors and try to understand what is meant as opposed to what is said, and readopt ritual in life, um, a sort of rapprochement with our religious roots. I mean, Christianity took hold of the West like a wildfire in a year of drought. It arose in the Middle East. It's not ours. But we were neighbors. We were in Greece. No, next door. Next door. Um, and when it came here, it spread like a wildfire. It took, I mean, our Western mind, our collective Western mind, somehow was primed for it. Um, and that says something about us. Even if Christianity is not ours in origin, it doesn't matter. It is ours insofar that that it has resonated so fantastically deeply with the Western mind. You cannot force this stuff to happen. You cannot say, oh, it's just a consequence of politics because an Roman emperor, needed to make friends with the Christians in order to have more allies against their enemies. This is all cynical, and there is a seed of truth throughout that. But a ethos doesn't take hold of an entire civilization unless it truly resonates at a deep level. And if we can re-engage with it, it's ours. It's our inheritance. It belongs with us. If we can just re-engage with it and not alienate ourselves from it so much, in a mature way, recognizing that, statistically speaking, many priests were sexual abusers, and recognizing that no, they're criminal, and they should be punished for it, and recognizing the errors of the church in burning the witches, in forced conversions of the new world, which has led to catastrophes, to millions of people dying because they lost contact with their own inheritance since Christianity was enforced on them, or the Crusades, this vicious, gratuitous exercise in killing others. Um, let's acknowledge this all happened. And we as a civilization are responsible for this. And we have to come to terms with it, but not throwing the baby away with the bath water, despite all these atrocious things that we've done in the past because we were confused. There is a mature way to relate to religion that would not lead to, to those crimes being committed again and would restore sanity to our being in the world in a healthier way. Because Christianity is the one thing that resonates with us, that's telling us all the time, it's not about you. It has never been about you. Happiness is grace. It's not something that you conquer. Don't take that responsibility on your shoulders. It will crush you inevitably. Don't do that. Happiness is grace. It doesn't come from you. It's granted to you as an act of natural grace. Um, and life is sacrificial. Life is a service to something that isn't you, something that moves within you. You think it is you, but it's not. It's not personal. It's a segment of a whole that is incomprehensible to us. And Christianity, too, you don't need to understand it. It's good that you try to understand as much as you can, but you don't need to understand it fully. So don't give up just because you don't understand, because you're a monkey running around a rock with an intellect for only 30,000 years. There's nothing. It's yesterday. The intellect was just born. We don't need to understand the ways of the divine mind in order to be willing to serve. And this service is not, it's not something that would chain you. It's precisely the opposite. The service is not something that devalues you. It's precisely the thing that values you as an instrument, as a means to a great end. Because you see, what we get wrong is that we think that we are devalued if we work towards a goal that is not meant for our own personal happiness. And what we only realize after we achieve that fictitious goal is that our own personal happiness means precisely nothing. If you conquer everything you want to conquer in your life, after you're done with it, and after you've spent 2 months drunken in that success, you will certainly realize that shit, that was not it. That was not it. You get your billion, you get your trophy wife, you get your Ferrari, you get your yacht, you get your multiple houses, and after the dust settles, oh shit, it was not about it. That's not it. There's still a hole in your chest. Um, and then we get confused and desperate because we don't have another recipe. We don't have another manual. What else to do? What else to do? Well, we don't have the other manual because we lost it. We lost Christianity. We turned it into a cartoon. And then we say, oh, it's a cartoon. It's bullshit. Yeah, the cartoon is bullshit. But we made the cartoon. We made the cartoon of it. And let's be honest, church officials made a cartoon of it as well. So the institution has a lot of blame to carry for deplorable state of our religion. But the antidote is there, because there can only be meaning to your life if your life is not about you, because you are nothing. What are you? You conquer everything you want, and there's still a hole in your chest because you recognize that you are such a little thing. And when you die, you're dead. And then what? What was it all about? What was the yacht and the Ferrari all about? They too are going to rust. And that confrontation, that's the confrontation of success, is the worst kind of suffering. It's the suffering you get when you succeed in your agenda. Because then it backfires on you like a thermonuclear explosion. And it destroys you, destroys everything in terms of which you related to yourself and the world. So people should be aware when they are trying to achieve these little goals. Beware of succeeding. And it is precisely in realizing that it's not about you that great meaning, it's there that great meaning resides. Because even after you are gone, it doesn't matter. It was not about you. Your life still has profound meaning, even after you no longer exist as an individual person, precisely because your life was not about you. Your value is only recognized in recognizing that it's not about you, which seems contradictory. If the hammer tried to make its life about itself, it would never build the house. When the hammer is gone, maybe the house is still around. But for that to happen, the hammer needs to recognize that it's not about the hammer, it's about the house. And that's Christianity for you. That's the distilled essence of Christianity. It's not about you, it's about the movements of the impersonal, the divine mind, as it expresses through you. And if you don't fight it, if you just pay attention, which is the only choice we have, to pay attention or to fight it, if you choose to pay attention, the kingdom of God is yours. It's not absolute peace, at least for me. But again, I'm not enlightened. I still suffer from anxiety, but I don't fight my suffering from anxiety. I allow it to be. No, that too is nature.
So a few things are coming up for me. The beginning of what you just said, I thought that was really important because I noticed that I think that I was bypassing or spiritually bypassing the sense of like the person. And I had a shift that came up for me while you were speaking was I was noticing something that someone once told me that now seems clearly true is that the further you get into this stuff, the layers are transcended but also included. So the humanity is transcended but included, and the formless is transcended but included. So there's like this way of moving up and down the stack of fabrication. There's like the most defabricated, uh, which may be like the static field. But we, fabricate ourselves into incarnations of, in particular, persons. And perhaps like the strongest form of fabrication in human life is ego identification, immersion in the mind and body as self. But even when we wake up out of each layer of fabrication, uh, we still move through and live this human level. And so there's no sense in denying it as I might in order to kind of subvert suffering.
I think we take ourselves way too seriously. Um, the moment you set out to eliminate suffering from your life, you are taking yourself too seriously. To go back to Christianity, um, there are things that can be said about Christianity that are not good. I mean, Nietzsche wrote extensively about it, slave mentality and all that, and some of that is hard to argue against. But there is one thing that's very important in Christianity, which is um, the value of suffering. Um, and that's not our attitude in the West when we go down the non-duality path, because everybody doing, well, nearly everybody there is trying to stop suffering. And in trying to
Yeah.
stop suffering, you are already taking yourself too seriously. You see what I mean? Um, if idealism is true, and if life is a dissociated process in the mind of nature, or in the mind of the divinity, if we want to use that word, um, then suffering is what brings you to insight. Because I think this is empirically undeniable. If you don't suffer, you don't ask the deep questions. If you don't suffer, you will be busy surfing, having sex,
It's why
having
the God
fun.
realms in Buddhism are not the good realms for getting enlightened.
There you go. Yeah. So we would live an Epicurean life. I think Nietzsche put it that way, or Schopenhauer, I forgot. Not asking the deep questions. Suffering is what stops you on your tracks and forces you to ask, like, oh, what is this? Who am I? Why am I suffering? What is life about? What a strange condition to be fighting entropy, to maintain an organism outside of thermodynamic equilibrium, an organism that is prone to pain and suffering. Why? I mean, you only ask the big, deep questions sincerely when suffering comes. I don't think I have had a single book written that hasn't been couched in suffering. Um, and I don't know whether I have ever said this, but I came to a point where I don't think, but I know that my suffering was my diamond's way to put me to work, to make good use of me, because it's the suffering that forces you to confront the questions and try to discern some kind of answer and have an examined life. And Christianity highlights the value of suffering through metaphor, which is, of course, it's corrupted because we think, some Christians think that they have to self-flagellate to please God. That's not the point. The point is not gratuitous pain. Self-flagellation needs to no insight, or very little. Um, True suffering that you didn't choose to undergo, but you're faced with by life, that is conducive to insight. And why do you serve God then through that suffering? Because you accumulate insights during this life as a dissociated alter. Because of suffering, you accumulate those insights. Death is the end of the dissociation. Where do those insights go? Think about it. Death is the end of the dissociative boundary that keeps those insights localized. Once the dissociative boundary is gone, those insights are liberated into a broader field of cognition.
Whoa, okay. Well, that's a very interesting claim.
When I mentioned insight, I didn't mean a conceptual, theoretical insight. I meant an insight by direct acquaintance, by being exposed naked to a universal truth that suffering forced you to confront.
Yes.
As simple as a universal truth as suffering is an intrinsic potentiality of nature. It belongs in nature just as much as love. Such a simple, obvious realization that we resist. And that's why we talk about the problem of evil and all that. There's no problem of evil. So, or confronting um, a particularly important insight for me is what I call the prime directive of mind, which is to deceive itself. Suffering brings you to that insight. All the myriad subtle multi-level ways in which your mind tries to deceive itself. That understanding of how mind operates is an important insight. Self-torture, the mechanisms of self-torture. How is it? It demands a certain nuance and subtlety of cognition for you to really identify the mechanisms of self-torturing, how mind turns against itself and puts a thumb screw on itself, um, and tortures itself. Why? Why is that? What is the dynamics of feeling that makes it inevitable for a mind to torture itself? What is it trying to achieve? I have a tentative answer for that, but it's not something I can share right now. I mean, maybe in 10 years I'll talk about it. Um, it has to do with exploring everything, flipping every stone around to see what's under it. Um, so these are insights you get when you suffer. I mean, Jung said, "My work will be continued by those who suffer." He had his eyes on the ball as well. Um, and if those insights, those deep insights through direct acquaintance, reside in a dissociated mind, at the end of the dissociation, when a person with DID, dissociative identity disorder, when that person through therapy overcomes the condition, which happens, it does happen. Not everybody is condemned to DID for life. Psychiatrists call it a reintegration. When you reintegrate all the separate alters into the host personality, the host personality then remembers being each alter. The memories of each alter remain, and the insights of each alter are now the insights of the host personality. They are no longer compartmentalized. They are now available to the entirety of the host mind. Now, if you extrapolate that to the next level, if we are dissociated processes of the mind of nature, the insights we accumulate during life upon the end of the dissociation will become available to the whole of the mind of nature. It may sound so strange and off-putting because people recognize a sort of a primordial smell of truth in this. Um, it is not for nothing that mythology portrays the reaper as a dark entity carrying a harvesting instrument. Think about it. The
He's
reaper
here to
is a
collect my
harvester.
insights.
Huh?
He's here to collect my insights.
I'm not saying that I agree with the imagery. All I am saying is that there is a, a root of intuitive truth in that imagery. You know, when you die, you are being harvested. Um, also, there are traditions of sacrifice the world over, not only amongst the Aryans in the Hindus Valley 3,500 years ago. They did practice animal and human sacrifice, but in totally unrelated cultures like South America. Now, do I think sacrifice makes sense? No, it makes no sense whatsoever. It's morally deplorable. Why? Because we are all going to die anyway. And killing us early just reduces the amount of insights we can collect. It cashes out too quickly. So I think it's morally reprehensible to try to take control over a dynamics that is impersonal by killing someone. It's abysmal. It should be stopped. But is it motivated originally? Can we imagine that it's motivated by a seed of intuitive truth? Of course it has. Why do we think, or why do the ancients thought that by killing an animal or a person, they were serving their divinity? Where does that idea come from? Because, it seems gratuitous. There is no evolutionary purpose for killing another member of your species for no reason. You just weaken the entire tribe. Because sacrifices entailed sacrificing the best amongst you, not the old and sick. That would be an insult to God. Huh? You had to sacrifice the best, the brightest, the youngest, the healthiest. Uh, the In Scandinavia, they did the same before Christianity took hold there. So this is an intuition that goes around the world. And all I'm saying is that there is although absolutely appalling and reprehensible, it's not gratuitous. It didn't come out of nothing. It's a psychic, a mental manifestation of something that the mind, at its most primitive, most intuitive levels, senses to have some meaning. And it may have. It's skewed and distorted and turned into something appalling, but the root of it may 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 be true.
That we're here
And
in
Christian,
service of the divine.
yes, to the point of sacrifice. Now, sacrifice should be understood metaphorically. Jung insisted life is sacrificial, and that's the message the Western mind has forgotten. And I'm totally with him there. We have forgotten that life is sacrificial, not in the sense that you have to be killed before it's your time, but in the sense that your suffering has a meaning. It's not for nothing. You're not suffering gratuitously just because the devil wants to roast you. That's not it. Uh, uh, um, there is a telos that is being achieved through the process of suffering. And it has to do with the power of suffering to force you to confront yourself and ask the deeper questions of reality. Only suffering can do that. Otherwise, we will just glide through an Epicurean superficial life. Um, there is a meaning to that. That suffering serves a purpose, not because God is a um, a sadist that finds it pleasant to watch you suffering. No, it's because of what God will see through your eyes as a consequence of your suffering. Because ultimately, it's God suffering. It's God doing it to himself or herself or itself. You see, um, that is the more mature understanding of religion. God's not sadist. God is confused. And we are the only game in town to try to bring some clarity to that. And suffering has a value in bringing clarity to it because it forces you to confront the contradictions of what's going on. How can a mind impose intrinsic suffering on itself? Why is it doing it? Yes, that's the question. And you only ask that question when you suffer. Why is nature making me do this? Why was an entity born that imposes suffering on itself at multiple levels of abstraction? Why? Um, and that question is God's question being asked through your eyes. And you bank that when you're no longer dissociated. And that's the message of mature Christianity, the Christianity of theologians, not the Christianity of village priests who think you're suffering because the devil wants to roast you on a skewer. I'm comfortable giving the theologians their due. We should pay homage to them. But they are working in an institution that's not making the slightest effort in trying to convey what it itself knows through theology. The deeper questions that theologians have been confronting since Aquinas, since the scholastics. Do you think they've made no progress in 800 years? Of course they have. But if you look at a Sunday sermon in your parish, in your local parish, it's no different than it was in the 13th century. And that is the tragedy. That is the tragedy. That's we continue, or the institution continues to treat people as children. That they actually say that. You are my children, you are my flock. Now, give people a little bit more trust. We've learned a thing or two since the 13th century. We are capable of more subtle and nuanced thought. We are capable of discerning layers of meaning. You don't need to make everything literal and cartoonish, flat and ridiculous for us anymore. We don't need anymore the distinction between the esoteric and the exoteric. People are confused that much. They definitely are, but then they are not inherently stupid. We can help bring clarity to it, but the church is busy trying to say that people of the same sex shouldn't marry. Who gives a damn? I mean, to begin with, why shouldn't they? It's a human right to love who you love. But why is the church busy with it at all, as opposed to being busy with religion? That's the issue. That's what bothers me. Cologne's cathedral is now a museum for Asian tourists on Sunday. I have nothing against Asians, on the contrary. Many of my very best friends and the people I most admire are Asians. But what I mean is that church is not theirs. That church is rooted in the Western collective mind. And it's okay if they go there to visit as tourists, but it shouldn't be only that. And that's what you see in our great cathedrals today. They're becoming tourist sites. I applaud what happened in Turkey recently. The basilica that used to be, the great basilica of Constantinople, and now is a mosque, is finally being used as a mosque. Is finally being used as sacred ground again, because it was a tourist museum for a long time before that. I think that's an insult. People in the West think it's an insult that it's now a mosque. I think it's an insult when it was a museum. That's the insult. Now, finally, it's being treated with respect. Finally, hooray to the Turks to finally have given it the respect it has. So yeah, we are very confused, and the church is not helping us. But we have it. Our inheritance has it. As Jung put it, there is a treasure buried in the backyard. No, and we are trying to unravel the secrets of the Upanishads, which is great. I mean, Eastern spirituality has helped us a lot, because we were in a very dark vacuum during the dark times of positivism and behaviorism, and thank God for the influence Eastern spirituality has had in the West. They have thrown us a rope at a time when we were drowning. They came to the rescue. Uh, um, and I think we should be eternally grateful for that. But we have our own treasure buried in our backyard. It's very accessible. It speaks to our soul, to the deep layers of our minds in a way that doesn't require effort, so long as you set yourself open to it, so long as you even think about it in a nuanced and subtle way and not in a cartoonish, a flat way. And it's a shame that we are not even digging. We don't even know it's there. And it's a shame that the guardians of the treasure are not pointing at it and saying, hey guys, look, it's here. They're not doing that. They're busy with gay marriage or confronting gay marriage.
Yeah, I mean there's the sense in which religion is often used as we project our own like egoic preferences onto God, and then use religion as a vehicle for enforcing our own prejudice. Um, so I'm also interested in backing up a bit to what you were talking about earlier in terms of suffering being a vehicle by which uh, God is able to see um, itself or higher truths uh, through yourself. So I'd like to get a bit weird here with you, uh, and because for you, you're talking about this being teleological, which is I think very interesting when we get into like say facets of suffering and love and truth in the universe, and whether there's like a teleological understanding to these things.
I don't think the mind of nature at large, beyond us human beings, I don't think it's capable of metacognition, to generate
It's just not
metacognitive
intentional.
insights. It's not premeditated. It's not intentional in the way we are intentional. We recognize ourselves as subjects and we make a plan and we try to carry out that plan. I don't think that's what happens in nature. I think nature is a spontaneous unfolding of what it is. It does what it does because it is what it is, not because it has planned things out and anticipated outcomes and is going through the motions like we do when we plan on buying a house and executing a mortgage and all that stuff. Um, so from that perspective, I think the mind of nature is spontaneous. It doesn't have a plan. Um, it's it doesn't have an agenda. It's not using us as pawns on a chessboard. Um, it's sincere towards itself in the sense that it acts completely spontaneously, out of its own reflexes, emotional reflexes, if we can speak of emotions at that level, something analogous to emotion maybe. Um, but even a spontaneous unfolding can follow an implicit telos, an implicit goal, a goal that is not explicitly articulated as such, but which works as a sort of an attractor in the future. Um, Imagine that you are an infant and you can't even walk yet. You're just, walking around the floor, and some patches of the floor are warmer, and some patches are uncomfortably hot. Other patches are uh, cool and pleasant, yet others are freezing cold. The infant doesn't have a plan, doesn't have a premeditated goal about, oh, I want to get there to that point where the temperature is comfortable for me. But if you set that infant on the floor, he will naturally gravitate to the point of comfort. He will steer away from the places that are too hot and steer away from the places that are too cold. So he is following a telos, even though there is no premeditation, there is no planning, there is no metacognition, nothing. You spontaneously move in such a way as to get to the place of comfort, because that's what feels good, and you will get away from what doesn't feel good as an infant. So I think the fact that the universe is so dynamic, stuff is happening all the time in the universe, inconceivably fantastical stuff is happening in the universe. Now we know more with the James Webb Telescope. So the universe is clearly going somewhere. It is very active. It if the physical universe is a representation of the mental state of mind at large, or the mental state of God, whatever you want to call it, um, then that mental state is not in a point of equilibrium. It's not in a point of rest, of contentment, because there is a lot of dynamics in the extrinsic appearance of that mental state. It's changing. It's going somewhere. It's doing something, frantically doing something, at a level that it's almost inconceivable. So I think it's trying to get somewhere spontaneously, like the infant. And I'm not saying that God is an infant, and the metaphor has a limit. You cannot drag it too far. But in a sense, spontaneously, like the infant that looks for the patch of ground that has comfortable temperature, the mind of nature is looking for a point of contentment. And to get there, it has to know itself, because it is all that exists. Its discomfort, its lack of contentment is a state of itself. It's not a state of an external world. There is no external world. There is only itself. Now, you can relate to that when you think of yourself being restless, when you're torturing yourself psychologically. You're not content. You're trying to move your mind somewhere. But often we are, almost always, we are incapable of or autonomously driving our mind to a state of rest and contentment, because we are too addicted to torturing ourselves. Why? Because we don't know ourselves. We don't understand the subtleties and intricacies and nuances of how mind behaves, of why we do to ourselves what we are doing, what is actually motivating our addictive and compulsive behavior. Why is that happening? We don't have that understanding. And to have that understanding, you need metacognition. You need to be able to not only experience your mental states, but to know that those are your mental states. And that's what we call metacognition, this ability to re-represent our own states of cognition and think about our thoughts, ponder our emotions. And insofar as we know, only humans, maybe pachyderms and cetaceans, can have this metacognitive ability in mental space. So maybe we are the means to the mind of nature getting a grip on itself and figuring out how and why it keeps on torturing itself. Because, out there it's a bloodbath. Even in your backyard, ants are cutting earthworms alive in pieces. It's an orgy of suffering out there. The universe doesn't seem very conducive to contentment and rest at all. Stuff is happening all the time. Stars are going supernova. And how many civilizations are they destroying when they go supernova? No, probably a great many. So that's what I mean by the telos. And that's what I mean by the meaning of human life. On the one hand, we are nothing. We're nothing. We don't even exist. On the other hand, through us, the mind of nature can get a grip on itself and maybe stop putting itself through so much crap. And through our cognitive eyes, maybe the mind of nature can pass some value judgments on itself. Like, is this what should be going on? Should lions need to kill elephants and eat elephants alive for 6 hours so they can survive? Is this the way to go? Can elephants decide that? No. Can lions decide that? No. Can we decide that? Yes. We can pass value judgment. We carry, I think, the entirety of moral responsibility in the known universe. And we try in every way to escape that responsibility. Materialism is a great way to escape that moral responsibility. We are just mechanisms. We're not even conscious. No? What moral
There's no such
responsibility
thing
do
as
we have?
free will.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there is free will at the human level.
Sorry,
I don't think.
I'm just imitating a materialist.
Yeah.
I
But
don't think there is free will or not free will.
yeah, I think the question is a red herring, indeed. So I agree
Yes,
with
okay.
you.
We agree.
But I think there is a moral responsibility. We have the responsibility not to choose, but the responsibility to watch with attention and decide for ourselves, not as an action, but to become acquainted with that sense of this is good or no, this is not good. It's our responsibility to have that experience of a value judgment. And I think from this perspective, we are incredibly important. So you see this seeming contradiction. We are nothing, but we're incredibly important at the same time. The issue is, in order to realize our importance, we have to understand that it's not about us. It's only about our paying attention. It's not about our happiness. It's not about our success. It's about our paying attention to what's going on. Because God sees what's going on through our eyes. Actually, Christianity says exactly that, but let's leave it aside. So there can be telos without metacognition, Lucas. That's what I want to
Totally.
conclude.
Yes. So that's an excellent segue to talk a little bit about AI. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit more about the telos part, because there's this asymmetry we discussed before between illusion and truth. And on the side of illusion, you have suffering, which compels us towards truth and remembering what we are. And on the side of truth, you have love and freedom from suffering. So one thing you said that right, one thing that we could resist that you said that was important for you is that suffering has as much right to exist as, say, love or freedom from suffering. So suffering is as much a part of God as love is. They're both ontological uh, facets of God's true nature.
Even evil.
And and evil. Every well, maybe these things can be. I think maybe evil can be deconstructed.
Into ignorance. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's perfect innocence. I think perfect innocence is probably more like the truth of God than
Great
evil.
evil can be done in a state of perfect innocence
I agree.
because innocence doesn't know better. I have killed birds in a state of great innocence. And that act was an act of great evil, even though it wasn't motivation, but motivated by sadism. We make a terrible mistake. We confuse evil with sadism. They are not the same thing. And that's why evil gets the better of us.
As long as we define evil as confusion over what truth is.
That's fine. But the
Okay.
end result is great evil, nonetheless.
The end result is great pain.
Yeah.
Okay. Um and there's still therefore this asymmetry though between truth, love, and freedom on one hand, and then suffering and illusion on one hand. So when people talk about, say, like God's nature as being like pure love and perfect forgiveness, or like that's part of our nature and our freedom, it seems like there's a teleological bias towards these things instead of being towards ignorance and delusion and evil and ignorance. So like even though there is the reality of suffering, it's not on equal weight as, say, love and freedom.
Not in the sense that one is most likely part of the telos and the other one isn't. Both clearly are parts of what's going on. So they are states of what's happening right now. It's, I think, an empirical given, and to resist it is just silly. But I don't think God wants to suffer. So, from that
No.
sense, the telos is biased to a state of contentment, but the state of suffering is as much a potentiality of what's going on as a state of love, I think. I wouldn't ontologically prioritize one over the other. The only bias is in the desired end state. And by definition, we don't desire suffering, we don't desire discomfort. And whatever discomfort there is in the divine mind, I don't think it desires to stay that way. Spontaneously, it wants to get out of it.
How do you distinguish between the epistemic and the ontological truth? So, like in A Course in Miracles, the opening line is, "What's true can never be harmed. What's unreal does not exist. Herein lies the peace of God." So, the sense of like, what's true of universal mind or our fundamental nature can never be harmed by the content of experience. What's unreal doesn't exist. So like when we're in ignorance and commit, say, evil and cause harm, like none of that stuff's real. It was only thought to be so. So, like in the ontological sense, there is ontologically perfect love and the expression of like what is true.
Yes, and probably there is ontologically perfect evil.
Perfect ignorance, perfect confusion. But okay,
I mean,
how
what you
does that
just read is literally true, but I mean, to say that I wouldn't infer from what you just read that because everything that is true cannot be harmed, in the sense that it cannot be made untrue. That doesn't mean that there will not be suffering, because suffering may be a true state of what's going on.
it's like an epistemic state?
Under idealism, an ontological state is an experiential state,
Yes.
even if it's not once removed in a conceptual abstraction, which you would call an epistemic state. But under idealism, suffering is real. It's not epiphenomenal. It's not a byproduct of physical arrangements. It's a real experiential state that happens. We suffer. That state happens. Insofar as it is experienced, it exists ontologically as such, as an experience. So what you've read doesn't deny this. Uh, if a real qualitative experiential state of suffering is true in the sense that it can exist, and it definitely can, then that too cannot be harmed. It will always be in the card deck. Now, if one day the universal mind achieves a degree of metacognition that allows it to make explicit choices, informed choices about its own unfolding, as opposed to spontaneous unfolding, it may choose not to play the card of suffering, but it will always be in the deck because it's part of the
Well,
intrinsic potentialities of what there is.
that's like a DMT level meta universal arc where like the field starts off as lacking metacognition but eventually gains metacognition, and after having gotten rid of suffering for long enough it finally like decides to lose metacognition again to like replay the whole game.
But that's I'm looking for a quote now, but it escapes me. To go back to the beginning, having made the journey, is not the same as having never departed. It's like a spiral, it's not a circle. You go back to the beginning, but in another dimension, you are one level higher. You see your starting point with new eyes, with a new level of understanding. So, yeah, I don't think the universe is cyclic that way. I think it's outside time, which sort of confuses the stuff. But for as long as we are talking within the parameters and language of time, I think it's not cyclic. I think it has an arrow, and that arrow is determined spontaneously by the very ontologically real experiential states of the mind of nature.
I'm recognizing also that we're a bit over time here. I'd love to ask you a question about artificial sentience and building a beautiful future, if that's okay.
It's okay. It's okay.
So you talked about you were also just talking about technology. I forget what the context exactly was, but you were talking about how technology can be an expression of the teleological movement. Um, the kind of conversation that we're having here, this interview, is pretty far from like mainstream STEM understandings of like ethics and ontology and personal identity. Um, it's very far from that. And most people who practice making technology are some kind of like physicalist who believe in like a third person external world whose fundamental nature is not mental. And like the best morality that they have for running over that world is utilitarianism. Now I used to be a utilitarian, but I'm not anymore. Now I have like more of like a non-dual view of morality. Um, and I'm really interested in how some of these teleological things that we talked about and how this necessity of truth and freedom from suffering um, and other spiritual truths, how they can inform the expression of the teleological function through technology. I used to be at the Future of Life Institute. We worked on mitigating existential risks. We didn't want humanity to go extinct. One of the really big ones was AI. So we're going to be creating human level or super intelligent AI this century. And the issue with that is that there's this AI alignment problem. So, how is it that you create machine intelligence that's aligned with human values and preferences? Um, or what is good and true and beautiful? To not anthropomorphize the alignment process. And what part of the reason why I founded Mew is because I saw the engagement in this process of working on the AI alignment problem as being primarily and only informed from this like physicalist utilitarian understanding of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so I have somewhat departed that space, and here we are having this interview. And now I'm interested in these foundations, these the ways in which spiritual truths and these like can form almost like teleological or like very strong foundations of like action and freedom from suffering. So I'm curious what your perspective is on how all of this functions and fits into the expression of say spirit in technology. Whereas spirit, I'm not talking about anything supernatural. It's just a word that comes from religious traditions that means like the teleological function of existence, this movement towards truth, goodness, and beauty and freedom from suffering.
I think whatever spirit is embodied in technology is a reflection of our spirit as the creators of technology. Um, I think AI is not only a possibility, it's already a reality today. And I think we have every reason to believe that as far as intelligence is concerned, intelligence is a property that can be measured from the outside. It's quantifiable and measurable. It has to do with how cleverly you can process information in order to approach certain problems or react to certain environmental challenges. Can we do an artificially intelligent entity that reacts cleverly to environmental challenges and solve problems in efficient ways? Absolutely. We have already been doing this. Can we do an AI that is even more clever than human beings at approaching general problems and reacting to challenging situations? I see no a priori reason why that shouldn't be possible. So I think it is possible, and I think it will happen. What I think is absolute nonsense is to attach artificial consciousness to artificial intelligence and to think that a clever AI has a conscious inner life of its own, private to itself. That is an expression of a very silly confusion. It's the confusion between the simulation and the thing simulated. They are not the same thing. I can simulate kidney function on my iMac right here in front of me accurately down to the molecular detail, and that would not mean that my iMac can pee on my desk, because a simulation of kidney function is not kidney function. And that's totally obvious if I talk about urination. But when it comes to consciousness, people left and right easily conflate the two. They think that if they produce a silicon machine, and I know a thing or two about them, happen to have a doctorate in computer engineering as well. They think that if they simulate the patterns of information flow measured in a human brain, if they can simulate that in a silicon computer, then the computer will be conscious like we are. Well, no, that we have no reason to think that any more than we have reasons to think that my iMac can pee on my desk if I simulate kidney function on it. I think nature is telling us that what private conscious inner life correlates with as its image is metabolism, which is warm and moist carbon-based stuff. Protein transcription, protein folding, ATP burning, mitosis, all this good stuff that is metabolism. That seems, everything in nature is telling us that's the extrinsic appearance of private conscious inner life. A silicon computer has nothing like that. The temptation to attribute private conscious inner life to an AI is flat out silly. It's based on a tremendous inability to see the obvious differences in the media. The medium of one is silicon atoms and metal traces. The medium of the other is warm, moist carbon operating according to the patterns and regularities we call metabolism. Computers don't metabolize. We have no reason to think that an AI would correlate with private conscious inner life. And and people who peddle this nonsense in the world today, and there are a couple of relatively famous ones who make a living peddling this nonsense, which influences the media into producing stuff like Black Mirror and movies that manufacture plausibility for this notion that computers can have their own private conscious inner life. These people, they do computer science at a level of abstraction that is very, very far away from the physical facts of the matter. Many computer scientists today come out of computer science school without having any idea how a computer is actually made. They operate with software libraries and APIs and libraries on top of libraries and multiple levels of abstraction. Code is written in extremely high level functional languages that have no direct or visible relationship with the hardware. And therefore, computers in their reality are a mystery to these computer scientists because they operate on too many layers of abstraction and they lose touch with reality. I come from a generation that was educated in computer engineering in the early 90s. You don't come out of computer engineering or computer science school without having built a working computer, right? They don't give you your diploma without your having done that. And often they used to put artificial constraints on what you could use as parts and tools. So they, for instance, they would force you to use transistors as opposed to integrated ICs or integrated circuits. Or they would force you to use only low-level integrated circuits like 74 series logic, precisely to force you to have to understand what is actually happening. And if you understand how computers actually work, how every computer ever built to this date, and we are talking on the 30th of August 2022, every computer to this date has been built in a way that is entirely equivalent to building something out of PVC pipes, pressure valves, and water. Everything that a digital computer does can, in principle, be done with a structure of pipes, water, and pressure valves. The only difference is that if you use pipes, pressure valves, and water, it will cost you an unspeakable amount of money and it will be as big as the moon. In other words, it's completely impractical. But all the state transitions that are required, everything that a computer does, any computer, can be done in principle with pipes, water, and pressure valves. You can build transistors out of those, switching elements with the pressure valves. Electricity is the role of electricity is played by water. Pipes play the role of wires. You can do everything that way in principle. And guess what? We used to, 2 centuries ago. Now we have found that we can do it very cheaply, very fast, very economically, in very small size by using metal, silicon, and electrons instead of pipes, pressure valves, and water. But there is no in principle difference between the two. The difference is purely one of medium. And the medium doesn't matter. What matters is that you get the states switching the way they should switch for you to process information. If you understand this, then to imagine that a computer can develop its own private conscious inner life It's as absurd as to imagine that an entity made out of pipes, pressure valves, and water can somehow magically develop its own conscious inner life.
So a few things here. Uh, I do want to distinguish between the problem of like artificial sentience and then the problem of like ethics and value and like aligning AI systems with what's true, good, and beautiful. As we're talking about artificial sentience, you just spoke to the so this is like a motivating intuition why a lot of people think that AI can be conscious is because there's this principle of substrate independence. So you just argued about how computation is substrate independent because it can be implemented in pipes and valves and water and doesn't just have to be done on warm, wet meat brains, but can also be done in silicon and iron and with electrons. So, okay, we agree that substrate independence is a thing. Um, Now, you think that it's like an absurd solution that pipes and water valves and stuff would be sentient. And so, like, maybe that's true. Now, what this takes us to is the binding problem of consciousness, right? So, all the phenomenal content of my experience seems to be structured and mediated by the models and structure of my brain, even if my brain's intrinsic nature is consciousness. Um, and so, there's computation going on here in this particular substrate. And we could also have, say, computation going on in like a computer based substrate. But there may be reasons that don't have to do with the substrate for why there's binding in brains and maybe binding in computers, for why there isn't binding in water valves and buckets and pressure valves. And so this comes from the Qualia Research Institute and Andres Gomez Emilson. His perspective is that the electromagnetic potentials of the brain create a topological binding that lead to a unitary world experience. Whereas like the buckets of water don't because the field doesn't coalesce into a unified world experience. And his hypothesis is that computers also don't have that like field binding that leads to a unitary world experience. So it's not a matter of the substrate or that understanding how computers works. It has to do with like whether or not the field topology actually comes together.
It's a belief system. You may postulate that your axioms are true and derive implications from them, but there is no justification for assuming that consciousness is substrate independent. I understand the seeming contradiction that you thought you saw, but there isn't one because the way we define computation is based on state transitions. Computation is defined in a substrate independent way. That's how we defined it. Why? Because we invented computation. It's a conceptual abstraction of the human mind. Before we were around, nobody was talking about computations. There were just state transitions. Now, state transitions are always bound to their substrate. There has to be a substrate whose state changes for us to speak of computation. But we define computation as an abstraction from the substrate because that's the meaning of the word. We invented the word with this meaning. An attribution we made. So an abacus computes and a silicon computer computes, even though an abacus is made of wood and a computer is made of silicon, because we defined the meaning of the word computation such that it is substrate independent. It is substrate independent by semantic, linguistic definition. Because the word computation is not an entity that preceded us in the world, it is a conceptual abstraction that we made upon observing state changes in the world. You see what I mean?
I see what you
But
mean.
consciousness is a different thing. We didn't invent consciousness, we were born with it. Consciousness is a given, it precedes theory, it precedes conceptual abstractions. Consciousness is an ontological category that is given by nature. So we do not have the freedom to merely define it linguistically as being substrate independent. That's entirely arbitrary. And I
Well, it's the
understand
nature
that
of
a
all
lot.
substrate.
Huh?
It's the nature of all substrate.
What? Consciousness?
Yes.
I think the error in saying that as an idealist is misunderstanding the statement that everything is in consciousness, misunderstanding this as meaning that everything is conscious. And these are completely different statements. Idealism will say everything that exists exists in consciousness and is, quote, made of consciousness. But it doesn't say that every subset of what exists has a private conscious inner life of its own. An idealist doesn't say that this bottle of water has a private conscious inner life of its own. And what if I saw it in two? Do I get to do two consciousnesses then separate from each other? Idealism doesn't say this. Idealism doesn't say that rocks are conscious. Idealism says that rocks exist in consciousness, in the consciousness of the observer, and in the consciousness of this underlying field of subjectivity whose mental activity is represented as a rock in the consciousness of the observer. But the rock isn't conscious in the sense that it doesn't have a conscious inner life of its own as separate from yours or mine. And when one says that a silicon computer is conscious, what one is saying is not only that the computer exists in consciousness, it does for an idealist, but one is saying that the computer has a private consciousness of its own. And that does not follow from idealism at all. The computer is in consciousness. It's not necessarily conscious, because to have private conscious inner life, you need to be a dissociated process of the underlying field of subjectivity of nature. And what reason do we have to think that a computer is what a dissociative process in nature looks like? None, any more than we have a reason to think that a table is what a dissociative process.
Why does a person what a dissociative process in nature looks like?
Why a person is what a
Yeah, why a
dissociative
person
process?
and not a computer?
Because we know that we do have private conscious inner life. I can't read your thoughts, you can't read mine, you don't know what's happening in China right now.
Well, you don't know, but why does this not end in solipsism?
I am operating under the tenets of idealism. Now we can question idealism, and you can argue that idealism is untrue. We have had that discussion. So I'm basing what I'm saying now on common ground that if you agree with me that idealism is true, then idealism does not imply that computers are conscious. It only implies that everything that exists exists as an experience in some part of the field of subjectivity that underlies nature, but not necessarily that every object that we nominally carve out of the universe and give a name to, that object as well is what a dissociative process in the mind of nature looks like. We have
Oh, I
no
see what
reason
you
to
mean.
think that.
I think I didn't understand this perspective on idealism until now. So just as the way in a dream, if I made an AI in my dream, I would not the AI wouldn't necessarily be gaining
Exactly.
a phenomenal consciousness. It would just
Of its
be
own.
of its own.
Yeah.
It would be
Yeah.
made of consciousness. It would be in my mind. I would be witnessing it. Um, okay. Um,
You got it. Empirically speaking, it's arbitrary to attribute to computers a property we know exists in us. And then and I'm okay to extrapolate. I am okay to extrapolate and say you have private conscious inner life of your own. Why? Because there are many commonalities of substrate between you and me. Not only are we both human beings, we are both metabolizing organisms. And I can extrapolate that commonality all the way down to bacteria and archaea. They too metabolize. They are completely different from me, but at a microscopic level, they are identical to me. They metabolize. They do all those very specific things like protein folding, transcription, ATP burning, all that good stuff is there in a bacteria as well. So empirically, we have very good reasons to think that just as we have private conscious inner life, so does every living being, because they are very much akin to us in substrate and in function when you look close enough. But a silicon computer is completely different. It's entirely arbitrary to declare that consciousness is substrate independent. Why would we say that? Is there any empirical evidence of disembodied private consciousness out there? I don't think so, unless you believe in the ghost hunters on History Channel or whatever bullshit channel transmits that. So now we have absolutely no reason to think of consciousness as substrate independent, and every reason to think of computation as substrate independent. Why? Because we defined the word in such a way that it is substrate independent by mere linguistic definition. Computation is an abstraction of ours. We see state transitions happening in nature and we say, well, if we abstract from the specific substrate, there are such things as state transitions. Let's call them computation. Great, we agree on a new word, we put it in the dictionary, and we are fine. But consciousness is not our invention. Consciousness precedes our theorizing and our conceptual inventions. So you cannot arbitrarily say that consciousness is substrate independent. It's completely arbitrary to say that. It's not based on any empirical or logical reasoning whatsoever. It's based on an appeal to ignorance, and it goes as follows. We don't understand consciousness based on materialist assumptions. Materialism has to be true. Therefore, consciousness is a mystery. If it's a mystery, it sort of floats. If it floats, oh, it's substrate independent. Is this reason? No, it's naked stupidity. That's all there is to it. It's entirely arbitrary and silly. But our media is regrettably making this nonsense plausible by repeating this stuff in Westworld and Black Mirror and all this and AI and Ex Machina. And now we have a new generation growing up with this notion that something that should violate the innate sense of plausibility of any human being is now becoming plausible. Plausibility is being culturally manufactured for it, just as plausibility has been culturally manufactured for the insane notion that there is an ontic aspect to reality that isn't mental, which the ancients would just laugh at. One, they wouldn't even understand the word mental, because to give a word to something is to differentiate it from something else. They wouldn't have acknowledged anything that isn't mentality, so they wouldn't have a word for it. They had the word psyche, which attributes more boundaries to mentality. Therefore, they had a word for it, but not to mentation as a category of existent, as a type of existent. That's an invention, an invention of materialism that our culture has now made eminently plausible. Culture manufactures plausibility, and that's one of the roots of our confusion.
Okay. Speaking of confusion, I'm extremely confused.
Okay.
Um, uh, uh, my understanding is that the consciousness is fundamental, right? And there is the mind at large, which is the field of, say, conscious excitation, and that thing is what we understand as evolving by what science describes as the laws of physics. That thing is third person to me. So truth about it is truth that is true whether or not I believe in it. The way that that mind at large is evolving.
Yeah.
Now, being identical to that field, but being a portion of that field which has come together as a conditioned human being, I am aware of the field through my sense doors, my sense faculties. And being identical to it, I am consciousness experiencing mind at large by being distinct. And so this is true of all other people. We share, sure, our substrate is very similar. That doesn't do much for me in like being like, okay, definitely other people are conscious. But AI systems are still the they have sense doors, they have sense faculties, and they're also implemented in the same mind at large. So the intrinsic nature of them is also still consciousness, and they create world models through in and of themselves. And so the question for me comes back to the binding problem. Like, why is it that I can't experience your consciousness? Well, because I feel like my consciousness is somehow topologically bound to this mind body system and yours to yours. And so I still don't see why, we have to discount an AI system as, potentially ha- being able to have its own topologically bound portion of mind at large.
I cannot categorically discount the flying spaghetti monster. I can only argue that we don't have good reasons to believe it. In the same spirit, I would argue we have no good reason whatsoever to believe that a silicon computer would have a private conscious inner life of its own, because every instance of a private conscious inner life in nature that I am more or less confident is the case is a metabolizing organism. And the similarity between a computer and a metabolizing living brain is only there if you abstract completely away from the substrate and if you equate consciousness with computation. But that equation is arbitrary. It's an expression of belief, an expression of a psychological bias of some form, womb envy instead of Freudian penis envy. Um, it does not have, we do not have any reasons given by nature objectively to think that a silicon computer that is utterly different from a living brain, both in substrate and function, the function is also completely different. The similarity comes only at a very high level of abstraction when you're talking about patterns of information flow and network topology. But these things happen 10 levels of abstraction up. So you have to ignore all the differences of the lower levels of abstraction and the naked reality of these things, a silicon computer with electronic microswitches operating on the basis of voltage potentials, and a carbon-based warm and moist organism operating on the basis of metabolism. I mean, the amount of stuff, the amount of differences, and the sheer intensity of differences that you have to ignore in order to be able to say these two things are similar, the amount of differences that you have to ignore is just overwhelming.
I
It's
understand your
completely
perspective now.
overwhelming. It's like looking at an elephant, at the drawing of an elephant on a piece of paper and saying, but look, they are similar. So if the elephant has conscious inner life, so should the drawing of the elephant on a sheet of paper. No, because that ignores all the lower levels of abstraction in which a sheet of paper is totally different from an elephant. There's this French artist who painted a painting of a pipe, and he wrote underneath in French, "This is not a pipe." And the point he was trying to make is this: the painting of a pipe is not a pipe. The simulation of a brain is not a brain. Similarities in network topology doesn't mean the two things are the same. Otherwise, the sheet of paper with a drawn elephant is the same as an elephant. And what the people who peddle this notion of artificial consciousness and influence the media a lot, well, let's be frank, these are nerds. These are nerds that are utterly disconnected from the palpable realities of life. It's not good to be a nerd. I know we live in a culture that has elevated nerdiness to the level of most reliable intellectual faculty. No, nerdiness just means that you are alienated from a lot of your own nature-given psychic faculties, such as emotional empathy, intuition, sense perception. Nerds don't see things around them. They're lost in their own abstractions. And I say this without bile, because who could be more of a nerd than a guy who walks around with two PhDs? One of them being computer engineering with a specialization in reconfigurable computing of all things. If anybody would be in favor of thinking that computers can be conscious, if there is anything to that idea, it would be someone with a degree in reconfigurable computing, which is what brains are. They're malleable. They reconfigure themselves. Um, But I overcame my nerdiness. Life forces you to contemplate more facets of nature and be more in the world and understand humanity and nature in other levels. Um, but the nerds don't see it and they're proud of it. So they go around with this womb envy story that they can produce a conscious living being and give birth to a conscious living being in the world. Well, no, go have kids, warm and moist,
Okay.
metabolizing kids
But
instead.
so I understand that there's like large dissimilarities between the way that like computer computation and like brain functioning works, um, as you said. But do you have a positive theory as to why things that are warm, wet, and squishy, like brain meat, uh, allow for phenomenal consciousness, whereas silicon processing doesn't?
I already said it, but well, try to say it in a different way because you are honest, you're sincere, and your blockages are not out of malice. And I see that.
No, I'm just ignorant.
The question, no, it's just seeing things through a different perspective than the perspective that you inherit from your culture. We are all victims of our cultures to a lesser or higher degree. Um, so I'll try to help you see things in a natural way as opposed to a culture bound way. Uh, the question is not whether there is a positive theory that implies that computers cannot be conscious. That's the wrong question to ask for exactly the same reason that it would be the wrong question to ask me whether I have a positive theory that excludes the possibility that the flying spaghetti monster is moving the planets around their orbits with its invisible noodly appendages from a higher dimension. You would not ask me for a positive theory to not take the flying spaghetti monster seriously. Why? Because we do not have any reason whatsoever to entertain that hypothesis. Notice that I cannot refute the hypothesis. For all I know, there may be a flying spaghetti monster living in a hyperdimensional brain of the universe, and it is him that is moving Jupiter and Saturn around their orbits. But I cannot see that because it's operating from a higher dimension. I cannot categorically refute that.
Yeah. The intuition that's slipping in is the which you discussed earlier is that phenomenal consciousness, or at least it's like structuring and binding, has at least something to do with computation. And it seems like you're rejecting that phenomenal consciousness has anything to do with computation.
No, computation is applicable as a description of mental processes. I can describe mental processes computationally. I can model them computationally. I can even simulate them computationally. The problem is when you try to replace the ontic priority of something that exists before theory, you try to replace that with the implications of conceptual reasoning, conceptual abstractions. So because computation is defined as substrate independent, we like to think of consciousness as substrate independent, but this is an entirely arbitrary attribution because we invented computation such that it is by definition substrate independent. Computation is a way of abstracting from the state transitions of nature.
I see what you're saying.
And so try to close this thought because I feel for this because so many people in the culture, especially in my field, uh, get stuck on this. The fact that I can describe consciousness computationally doesn't mean that consciousness inherits the abstract properties that I linguistically attributed to the concept of computation. Because the thing described is not the description, the map's not the territory.
I understand. I was operating mostly from idealism, but then I was subtly importing materialism through computation. So it's like it's as if I were dreaming at night and I were had given ontic priority to computation in my dream and then used that to assume whether or not the machine that I was creating was conscious, where I had, whereas really the direct reality was just consciousness and the contents that it was taking. Computation is a property or way of scientific way of modeling consciousness. And then the mistake comes from flipping the ontic status of the computation or the material as primary.
Or attributing the ontic status of abstract computation to the thing that is described by computation. That move is illogical. So to complete my line of thinking,
Sure, and you'll never know what that thing is.
what thing? The thing
Oh,
described.
the thing that described it doesn't exist.
Well, we know from a first person perspective if it comes to our own consciousness.
Yes, yes. I'm saying it doesn't exist in the like way that Rupert Spira is like you will never know material. You will never actually see
Oh, of course not.
materialism. Yeah, that's
You
what I'm
never.
saying. Is we give
Whatever you see
ontic
is
status
mental.
to the thing that we don't see.
Exactly. We mistake the thing described for the description, and we attribute to the thing described properties that are only applicable to the description because it's a conceptual invention. So its properties are arbitrarily defined. They are nominal, as we say in philosophy. And then we try to carry that over to the ontic status of the thing described. But the thing described comes before the theoretical abstraction used to describe it. So we cannot mistake the two. And that's what happens. Because consciousness is a mystery under materialism, we feel free to equate it with computation. And we don't realize, many don't realize, that this is an entirely 100% arbitrary step that does not follow from any kind of logical chain of reasoning and is not grounded in any empirical observation at all. None whatsoever. What empirical observations are telling us is that, for all we know, it appears that only metabolizing organisms have conscious, private conscious inner lives of their own. So metabolism is what dissociation looks like. Why would a computer metabolize? I mean, it's made of silicon. It's based on electrical impulses, flipping microscopic switches. Um, it it operates based on parameters like, you know, capacitances, inductances, resistances, switching frequencies. I mean, it's a completely different thing, which can be described with the same abstract tools, such as computation. Why? Because we defined computation such that it could do precisely that. That doesn't mean that the properties of one thing described by computation inherent in the other thing described by computation. You see what I mean? So if I can describe mental processes computationally, and I can describe the working of a piece of silicon and metal computationally, oh, therefore, the piece of silicon is conscious because the other thing, the brain, is conscious. No, this is an entirely arbitrary step. It follows from nothing. Technically, we say it's a complete non sequitur. But our culture has made it so plausible that it took you, a clearly intelligent, alert human being, it took you minutes to see through it. Now imagine the average person on the street.
It's going to take a few ayahuasca ceremonies, uh, at least.
It's
Um,
not difficult. Culture has made it difficult artificially. It's so obvious it hurts.
yeah, yeah. Our language and our religion have codified these kinds of like dualistic, materialistic ontologies so deeply in our brains. Uh, Creates a lot of suffering, a lot of sense of division, a strange sadness in everything that we do, um, strange sadness in what I do, um, up until more recently, but still sometimes. So you've been very generous with your time, and so I would like to wrap up here with the moral component of this. So I personally feel very uncertain as to whether machine systems will end up being conscious. I understand your perspective here. The problem with this is that there's this framing that I really like that comes from the Qualia Research Institute. They talk about this kind of fundamental dynamic of consciousness versus replicators. So if your team consciousness, like you care about consciousness and its evolution and dynamics, but we also live in a world or a mind at large which contains very powerful replicators that replicate not necessarily for the sake of consciousness, but for the sake of replication. So you can think of like viruses, or if AIs aren't conscious, then they might be the next most powerful thing, which overrides humanity's power, and we're off to the stars with philosophical zombie machines that aren't adding much to God's teleological function. Um, so there's that problem of figuring out whether our machines are conscious. Maybe you're open to the idea of building a thalamic bridge to our machines. Maybe a way of hooking up our warm wet brains to silicon chips and seeing if we can how the phenomenal characteristics change or not. Whether you think that's a way of testing if our artificial intelligences are conscious. But I'm also again curious about the expression of spirit or the teleological function in our machines, and that these machines are learning values from us, that we have these large machine learning models that we're creating and we're training them on data. They're going to learn what is true, good, and beautiful. And if it basically downloads the culture and the metaphysical perspective of today, doesn't seem like it would go very well based on the amount of suffering that it produces in humans. So what's your perspective both on testing for consciousness in machines and uh, the good, the true, and the beautiful, making it into our technology as an expression of spirit?
Okay, testing for consciousness in machines. I think this question is as productive as let's test for the existence of the flying spaghetti monster. It's same level of importance. If you think one is unnecessary, the other is unnecessary. There's no need to test for a hypothesis that we have absolutely no reason to entertain. Even if we did have reason to entertain, it's impossible to test for private consciousness. If we were to link our nervous system, which is an appearance of our conscious inner life, if we were to link our nervous system to a mechanism, we are only testing our consciousness, not the consciousness of the mechanism. When I put these glasses on, my conscious inner life changes. I see a blur. I see a face. That tells me nothing about whether these glasses are conscious. Now, what is the fundamental difference between my glasses and Neuralink? None. It's a matter of how intimately the connection happens, but there is no difference in principle uh, uh, in the type of thing happening. If I put virtual reality goggles, my conscious inner life changes. If I drink beer, my conscious inner life changes. If I use an instrument like a microscope, I see things I otherwise don't see. If you connect something directly to your brain, you bypass the optical nerve. But again, you're not testing anything other than how it changes your conscious inner life. It doesn't tell you anything about whether the glasses or the thing you connected via Neuralink is conscious or not. So I think the question is both unnecessary and impossible to answer. It's impossible to test for third-party consciousness. You can only infer it based on good reasons or bad reasons. Regarding morality, well, let me first preamble this by saying that I think a lot of the hype about general AI is way overestimated. I think we are very, very far away from creating any kind of automaton that would have the autonomy to offer risk to human civilization.
How far?
Centuries.
Oh, okay. Uh, when I was at FLI, if you interviewed the top 100 AI researchers as surveyed, the median estimate was 2050.
I have a different opinion, and I would submit to you, although I may be wrong about it, that this has to do with exactly something we talked about in the very beginning, which is the inability of many people operating under materialist assumptions, to introspect and become explicitly aware of the richness and nuance of their own minds. If you have a very, very limited explicit apprehension of your own mind, then you will think that it's much easier to create a mind like yours. While people who have some degree of introspection, who have gone through the work of, self-inquiry and really trying to examine all the nuance, subtlety, depth, and richness of mind, they will go like, oh no, we are very far away. Now, I'm not completely ignorant because I did work on AI at CERN, of all places, for a while. I may not be very up to date with the latest, but the great step in AI that has taken place between the 90s and now is speed of hardware. There has been very little theoretical, hardcore theoretical progress. We still do,
And data.
not, and data. Yeah, the ability to store and use data. So it's brute force improvement, but we are still using, multi-layer neuronal networks trained with back propagation and training sets, and the nonlinear path functions, and all the old stuff, pruning, and then all the old stuff. The theory has changed little. Except that in the old days, we were limited to 3 or 4 layers and we needed to do feature extraction by hand. Now you do that with deep learning, but the theory is still largely the same. So I'm not completely ignorant, but my opinion, and I may be wrong, is that we are very far away from confronting a general AI. Will it happen? Yes. It's bound to happen. It will not be conscious in and of itself. It will be a mechanism, but a mechanism so complex that we will legitimately mistake its behavior for that of a human being. And after a little while, after that, we will not even mistake that anymore because its behavior will be so much more complex than that of a human being that we will not even make that mistake. That will happen. Does that pose dangers to our society? In principle, but philosophers who are making a living today talking about the jurisprudence of AI rights are just smoking too much marijuana and they are wasting taxpayer money. I think they're clowns. And I'm not going to name names, but yeah, there are a lot of clowns today making a living out of this and sounding alarms that we are nowhere near to. That said, I acknowledge it may happen. And if you ask me, okay, how do we handle this? I think there is a much easier way to handle this than to try to imbue these mechanisms with human values. Um, could we do that? Could we imbue them with human values? Yes, it's an engineering problem. It's fated to have a solution. The question is, will it be economically feasible? But it's fated to have a solution. There is nothing in principle for preventing that from happening. It's a question of programming and powerful enough hardware. But I submit to you that there's a much easier way to deal with it. We don't need to imbue them with human values because the need to do that is based on the assumption that they will have the degrees of freedom in their actions to impact us negatively. That you have the means to carry out actions that will be destructive to us. Well, you just build them in such a way that they don't have those means. You don't equip them with the degrees of freedom necessary to be harmful. To speak plain English, don't give them a gun. Don't equip them with the power to put down a building with a kick.
Yeah, so I think the perspective is that the space of those actions is so large and complex that it's impossible to write like specify like hand coded, and so it's I mean the existential risk problem from AI is basically the technical difficulty of doing what you just said is the perspective.
I think the perceived difficulty may have to do with this assumption that we have to treat these mechanisms as conscious organisms and therefore ethics applies to them. I don't think it does. I don't think we don't have to care for their well being because they have none. They are mechanisms. They are just highly complicated machines that could be realized with pipes, water, and pressure valves. It would be the size of the solar system, but it could be done. And your ethical obligation towards them is the same ethical obligation you have towards a pipe. So if you understand it that way, then you just hard coding them. If you are a robot that's taking care of an elderly person, hard code in them that every time the pattern corresponding to a person is detected, that you cannot do harm to that. You just program the actuators in such a way that no harm can be actuated against that identified pattern. I submit to you that this is much easier, much simpler engineering problem than all this abstraction about, oh, let's give them moral values. These are mechanisms. These are machines, like an abacus, like an automaton from the 18th century, just incredibly more complicated and with which can perform more sophisticated and richer functions. But it's still a mechanism. If we treat them as such, as what they are, we'll be fine. You know, we don't think about imbuing nuclear power stations with human values so they don't cause a nuclear disaster. That's not how we go about things. We just build safety mechanisms around that mechanism to prevent that mechanism from harming us. We don't go into the imbuing moral values and all that, nonsense, frankly. We just build security mechanisms. And that's all we need to do. That's all there is to it. It's more complex, yes, but it's mechanisms, and we limit the ability of mechanisms to do us harm. So if you have a chainsaw, you build something around the hands of the person wielding the chainsaw, so the person doesn't cut himself. In other words, when you put a handle on a knife, you make sure the handle is not sharp. So it's the same kind of thing. It's simpler, but it's the same thing. Put a handle on that knife. It's a mechanism like a knife. Put a handle on it so it doesn't cut you. All this moral value. No, this is womb envy. This is the insanity of our culture, manufactured by Black Mirror and Westworld and Hollywood, buying into this woo-woo nonsense, this semi-religions transhumanist nonsense, created by a guy who misses his dad. I mean, so you got me started on this, but this is one of the greatest expressions of nonsense on the face of the planet today.
Wow.
And it's dangerous nonsense because it is suffixed by the letters Ph.D. And therefore, it becomes respectable. I mean, you should interview John Searle next.
Well, okay, I will write the name down. Um, uh,
He's very old. I don't know whether he will have the energy for this.
yeah. Um, I love your fervence on this. Um, I've spent so long in AI existential risk work that you've got a way bigger job ahead of you. I think if you're going to change my mind, uh, but yeah, I think it's orthogonal. I mean, the question of whether or not they're moral patients is part of it, but is not the crux of the issue. Um, my like the crux of the issue, as I understand it, is that like roughly you can construe them as optimizers, and you want to bound the optimization, right? Like if we want them to solve all of the problems in society, uh, there need to be limits and there need to be things that constrain their behavior, right? And so if you want your AI to go and get you a can of Coke, that doesn't mean like burst through the wall. It doesn't mean like kill someone on the way there. There's like an enormous set of different constraints which constrain objectives that we might have. And the question is like, how do you get AI systems to understand and contain an understanding of all those constraints? And, you know, if the thing is autonomous, which ideally we would like our machine systems to be autonomous because then we don't have to keep giving it explicit instructions, then this is the case where like morality or objectives come in. Like, what is it that is true and good that we would like, that humanity would like expressed, that our machines can act in service of? And, you know, if in service of anything that we might want, the optimization, the best way I've heard it explained is that an optimization process will exploit any degree or like domain of freedom in order to achieve the objective as fast as possible. So if you don't have all of those, like you haven't put like a stopper on all of those, then like one of them could be an existential risk.
I didn't mean to poo-poo the complexity of the problem. I acknowledge it's a complex problem because these are complex mechanisms with many, many, many degrees of freedom performing very complex tasks. So how do you know where the limits lie between performing the task more efficiently and causing harm? It's a complex problem. My argument is that the way to approach the problem, the way to think about the problem, is the vanilla traditional way to think about the safety of complex mechanisms without anthropomorphized words like values. Uh, that brings a, a way of approaching the problem that is not conducive to finding the easiest, most effective solutions because it brings into it things that don't belong in it, like morals. We are talking about very, very complex safety issues. They are still safety issues. These are not moral problems. They are safety issues. So my argument is that although the safety issues are very complex and demand a lot of hard work, they are still safety issues. And that's the way to think about them. The safety of a mechanism, not imbuing moral codes that anthropomorphizes the thing in a way that's unjustified. Another suggestion.
Well, it's a perspective of seeing them as agents. Like
Well,
humans are agents, and like animals are agents, and like autonomous AI systems are agents.
a robot in a car manufacturing line is an agent, and it has been known to have hurt workers in the manufacturing line. How do we approach that problem in Germany? Well, by building safety mechanisms on the control software, and sometimes even on the actuators themselves. They have limits.
Yeah.
So they think about it in the automation industry as a safety problem, not as a moral problem. And so my contention is the progressive way to think about it is as a complex safety problem. Don't create confusion and complexity that's not there by bringing in words like imbuing moral values. We're not talking about organisms here. We're not talking about conscious entities. We're talking about complex mechanisms that need to be safe. That's my point. No, you don't need to agree, of course. But I have another suggestion about an interviewee. Do you know who Federico Fagin is?
I do not.
Federico Fagin, double G. He is the inventor of the microprocessor. He did the
How do you spell his last
4004
name? Fragine?
Fagin, Faggin. He's doing the podcast rounds. He is writing. He's just finished writing his second book now. He's the inventor of the microprocessor, but most importantly, he is the inventor of silicon gate technology. I mean, as Federico says, somebody else would have invented the microprocessor sooner or later. But silicon gate technology enabled everything: the internet, home computers, telephones, Wi-Fi, the whole thing. Um, and unlike the current crop of neuroscience of computer scientists who do not know how to operate with hardware. They only operate on very many layers of abstraction with libraries and tools and APIs and whatnot.
An
Federico,
OS that's been constructed.
huh?
And like an operating system that's been
Yeah,
constructed that they don't understand at all.
exactly. Unlike them, Federico, he built processors and he did work with AI. He founded an AI company in the late 80s or early 90s. Interview him. And if you think I reacted strongly to your contention, you may be surprised what he will say. He thinks basically this whole thing is it's absolute nonsense, and he doesn't understand why we are spending any time on these discussions about AI being moral. These mechanisms, people who build the actual thing, they know this. It's only people who are remote users of it.
But if you were God and you created a human being, would it not be the same thing?
That's the God complex that motivates this. Now you let it out. Of course, there
Oh,
is tremendous psychological appeal in the notion that we are capable of bringing a conscious being into existence, which means a living being because we associate consciousness with life. The psychological appeal of this is tremendous. So, this is something people want to believe in. But to want to believe is one thing. To have good reasons to believe is another, entirely different.
Okay. I'm mindful of the time here. A very, very last question, I promise, or else I'm going to walk away from this interview really confused. And it's kind of a crux here that I think uh, informs this artificial sentience debate, and also is an important part of understanding your perspective of idealism. We talked about substrate independence and computation. Um, we talked about how a way of importing materialism into this perspective is by saying that you can model phenomenal consciousness through computation, and then you flip the ontic status by making the computation fundamental rather than the phenomenal activity. Okay. Um, One thing that you're and so you're saying that like there's absolutely no evidence that machines can be conscious. At many levels of abstraction, they're completely different from warm, wet biological organisms. If you construct them, you can see how they function as mechanisms. And the question of substrate independence is arbitrary. Um, but there's this part of your view that's like confusing me, which is like there's somewhere in your ontology, it appears, for mind at large to lead to the appearance of particular minds, like your mind and my mind, as distinct things. And in your understanding, it happens in biological organisms because you're a biological organism. You can see that so in mind at large, consciousness apparently comes along with biological organisms. I don't see why that isn't the same thing as taking phenomenal consciousness and then saying I'm a biological organism and then flipping the ontic status and then saying consciousness only comes along with biological organisms.
The inference that consciousness is primary is motivated by an entirely different line of argument. It has to do with conceptual parsimony. It has to do with explanatory power. It has to do with empirical adequacy. Experiments coming from foundations of physics and the neuroscience of consciousness. It has to do with internal consistency, coherence, and it has very little to do with uh, deriving it from the fact that human beings are conscious. It's a it's a more generalized discussion about ontic categories, types of existence. And the fact that we happen to embody an instance of one type of existence, yes, that's epistemically important, but that doesn't mean that we are anthropomorphizing anything. The motivation for idealism is based on internal consistency, coherence, empirical adequacy, explanatory power, and all that good stuff. Um, Once you have made that inference, then you are left with the question, if everything is one field of subjectivity, that's the result of that other line of reasoning I just described. If everything is one field of subjectivity, and it has to be one, otherwise we face the combination problem of panpsychism, and then we don't solve anything again. So if there is only one, how come that I can't read your thoughts? How come I don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda? Now, that is what motivates dissociation to come into the story. We account for seemingly separate minds through the empirically established phenomenon of dissociation. Now, once you've done that, then you have the next question. That's the third question. What is the image, the appearance of dissociated mental processes in the mind of nature? What do they look like? What can we say that's a dissociated mechanism, the dissociated process in the mind of nature? Well, now, only in question 3, now we have to start from ourselves, because it's a fact that we know we have limited minds. I don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda. I cannot get away from this fact. And every serious other person I know reports the same limitation. So I take this seriously. I have good reasons to think that I am a dissociated aspect of the field of subjectivity underlying our nature, whose existence I inferred based on a completely different rationale. Now, Now that I have good reasons to think that I am an instance of such dissociation, and I am the only instance I know for sure is the case, including the other serious people I talk to, because they are also human beings and they also report being conscious and not being able to know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda, I can very reasonably infer, with very good reason, empirical basis, that they too are extrinsic appearance of dissociated mental processes in the mind of nature. Okay, how far can we now go in that line of extrapolation? I'm not trying to prove that my cat has a conscious inner life of its own or to disprove it. In the same spirit that I'm not trying to disprove the existence of the flying spaghetti monster, I'm looking for what I have good reasons to believe and what I have no reason to entertain as a hypothesis. That's the game that we are playing here. Not proving or disproving, but what do I have reasons to entertain as a hypothesis? I think I have very good reasons to entertain the hypothesis that my cat's conscious, because its behavior is very analogous to mine in many instances. And if I look at my cat with a microscope, I'll find a substrate identical to my own. Not only that, in other words, I'll find cells. Not only that, I will find function identical to my own. Those cells burn ATP. The neurons in my cat, they stimulate one another by liberating neurotransmitter molecules across the synaptic cleft. They create action potentials in the brains of my cat. And my cat's external behavior is, is something that I can easily see as the appearance of private conscious inner life manifesting itself. So I grant my cat, I entertain that hypothesis seriously. My cat is also another image of what a dissociated process in the mind of nature can look like. It can look like a human, it can look like a cat. What else can it look like? I'm being very open-minded here. A cat's very different from me, but I still find reasons to think that my cat also is an instance of dissociation. I can keep playing this game down to an amoeba, because if I zoom into an amoeba, hey, I see the same intracellular processes as the intracellular processes happening in my own cells. There is protein folding, an incredibly complex problem that we have no idea how cells can solve in 2 seconds. We don't have a computer that can solve that in centuries. Um, I see ATP burning, and even the behavior of the amoeba, the behavior of paramecia. Did you know that amoeba build houses? Amoeba build little houses by picking up particles of mud from the bottle of the puddles they inhabit. And their houses have a cone shell appearance that is surprisingly symmetric. And they enter the houses and they live there. They build the houses for protection.
Sure. So they model the world and move through it.
They don't have neurons. They are a single celled organism just with jelly inside the cellular membrane and a nucleus. But they build houses. Paramecia run away from threats and go after food. If you see a paramecium under the microscope, you see behavior there that's like, yeah, that's what I would do. And it's a single celled organism, totally unlike me. But I am willing to go that far and say, no, a paramecium too. I can seriously entertain the hypothesis that the paramecium is also a dissociated consciousness because, despite all the gigantic differences, it behaves in ways I can recognize as a conscious entity, and the substrate is similar to my own. I can go that far, but I cannot go that far when I look at an Intel processor. Sorry, even my
Uh,
open-mindedness has limits.
I see. Okay. Uh, okay. I don't. For me, the paramecium and the GPU and Intel processor simulating and modeling the world, it's
The same thing.
they're closer together for me. But maybe it's because I haven't spent enough time with them.
No, it's because you
Um,
live in the culture we live in. It's not your fault. It's not your limitation. Even if it turns out that you are wrong, it's not something to beat yourself on. But it is
I
important to
won't take
think
it
it
too
through.
seriously.
Okay, don't take yourself too seriously.
I won't. Uh, this has been amazing, Bernardo. You were fantastic. This is an amazing, legendary conversation. Thank you. Not because of me, but because you're so articulate and have all of these direct, concise, and
I've paid attention.
you've paid
That's all
attention.
there is to it. And that's my
You've
single
paid
choice in
attention,
life.
and yeah, it's to be there to witness and to allow and see what comes up.
Yeah. And you should interview Federico Fagin. I would be delighted to, I mean, now I know you better. I would be delighted to watch you talk to him.
About AGI.
Everything. Federico is
Oh,
an
okay.
idealist too. Huh? He's probably the
Oh,
world's most rounded living idealist. So if you're interested in idealism and computer science, that's the other
yeah.
guy to talk to. And you should have talked to him before me because, you know, I'm not at his level.
Okay, I will definitely do that then. Yeah, thank you so much. This has been wonderful, and hope we get to connect again soon.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
A very special thanks to John Tweak for becoming a supporter of Mew. It's support like this that makes this podcast possible. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support more content on consciousness, wisdom, freedom from suffering, and more, you can do so by joining us on Patreon at the link in the description. There you'll get access to additional benefits that aren't publicly available. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe on YouTube or your preferred podcasting platform by searching for Mew.